Welcome everybody to the Climate Safe California webinar series. I'm happy to see people logging on. My name is Duran from the Climate Center, and I'll be your MC and host today. We have an amazing lineup of speakers to talk about Climate Safe California at our 2020 Policy Summit. So we want to thank you all for being here. And I've just got a few things to cover before I turn it over to our Government Affairs Manager, Vince Warrant-Maja, and then we launch into our incredible program. We've got so much planned for you here today that I want to just go over the agenda real quick so that you can plan your next couple hours and make sure you don't miss the stuff you absolutely want to hear. After some opening remarks from myself, we're going to be hearing from Senator Henry Stern on California legislation, and then from Anthony Adragna on what's going on in Washington. Then at 10:06, we'll have our science panel with Professors Daniel Swain and Dan Kammen to find out what we're up against. As we all know, the situation is dire and the time for action is now. Then we're going to move into some specific policy areas, talk about community resilience. We'll then have a short break and then move on to nature-based sequestration, then another little break and talk about sustainable mobility. You can see the names of all the speakers. We'll introduce them as they pop up. And we're very happy that all of you could be here. Before we go on, I would just want to say a couple of words about the Climate Center. Many of you have attended our webinars over the past months, and many of you are familiar with who we are, but some of you don't know about the Climate Center. We're a nonprofit based out of Northern California, working throughout the state of California, from Chula Vista to Crescent City, on speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions. Many people know us for our role in growing community choice energy, which has been a key strategy and a key policy and a great example about what we need to do in every sector of our economy in order to move towards a climate safe future. Before I turn it over to Vince to talk a little bit more about Climate Safe California and how you can help support this policy program, I just want to take a moment to thank our many sponsors who've made this program possible. Thanks to Renewable America, Enphase, Jackson Family Wines, all of whom are working very hard in this area, Recology, Willow Creek Wealth Management, Soylent Company, MCE, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, the CCAs, including Peninsula Clean Energy and Silicon Valley Clean Energy, River City Bank, Sunrun, Terra Verde Energy, a broad sector, as you can see. Every sector of the economy stands to benefit from better policies on climate. I also want to thank our promotional partners, without whom many of you would know about this. So thanks to all these folks who've helped us spread the word: Actera, Better World Group, CalCan, Grid Alternatives, ZEV 2030, Move LA, Joint Venture Silicon Valley, Clean Coalition, Climate Resolve, the League of Conservation Voters, Drawdown Bay Area, Local Government Commission, Community Environmental Council, and the Center for Sustainable Energy. Again, climate policy is a team sport, and we'll only get there by working together in coalition. So I want to thank you for being here to learn about what all these folks think is important and what we at the Climate Center think is important. So with those opening remarks, I'd like to turn it over to our Government Affairs Manager, Vince Warrant-Maja, to tell you a little bit more about Climate Safe California. So thank you very much. And Vince, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Duran. Appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and present my screen. All right. So my name is Vince Warrant-Maja, as Duran was saying. I'm the Government Affairs Manager with the Climate Center, which effectively makes my job the in-house lobbyist for the organization. And so what I wanted to do in that capacity is talk about Climate Safe California, which is our flagship policy campaign. Before going into the policies itself, just to set the stage a little bit, the science is very clear that climate change is here, and it's happening much faster than even the most dire modeling from the past couple of years have predicted. One clear example of the impact of global warming is the mega drought that we are seeing roll out in our everyday lives as we see more and more conservation measures be enacted and more alarms being raised by our state officials and local agencies. It's something that we're going to have to adapt to live with, and it's something that is bluntly staring at us right in the face. This drought is threatening our economy. The last drought cost about $2.7 billion and tens of thousands of jobs in the agricultural sector. And that's just one very stark example of why this policy campaign and your participation in it is so urgently needed. So what is Climate Safe California? It is our push to get more aggressive, equitable, and accelerated timelines in California policy enacted now. Our overarching goal is that by 2025, we will have enacted the bold policies that are needed by science, called for by science, to dramatically cut reductions in the state, draw down and secure resilient communities for everyone by 2030, and therefore set the tone for the rest of the nation and the rest of the world. As you know, we've seen California policies be replicated in other states and at the national level. And so we need to continue in our climate leadership where candidly, we've been slipping. Our Climate Safe California campaign is guided by three overarching principles. The first is that it is science-driven. That is one of the touchstones upon which the Climate Center is founded. The second is that we want to ensure that the transition is just for fossil fuel workers and for everyone involved in as we shift towards a green economy. And the third is that we prioritize climate justice and ensure that our vulnerable communities are no longer disproportionately impacted by fossil fuels and have equal access to climate solutions. So what are we talking about when it comes to the goals for Climate Safe California? Right now, the state level goals are a little slow, quite frankly. 2045 is what we're targeting for carbon neutrality, at least in terms of what's set into executive order and state statute. And so we want to move faster. And what does that look like? Enacting a statewide policy that will set the target of net negative emissions, not just carbon neutrality, but net negative emissions by 2030. It is bold, it is ambitious, but it is what is needed in order to address this climate crisis. But of course, that is going to be a huge task, and setting targets, while important, is, you need to back up those targets with actual concrete steps. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to support achieving those targets by walking through several key sectors, including natural and working lands, the phase out of fossil fuels through sustainable mobility, and community energy resilience. And by taking steps in the right direction, in each of those key sectors, you start building up the blocks necessary to actually make that 2030 net negative emissions target a reality. So that's the overlay of what we're going to do today. But I do want to note that throughout today's panels, we are going to be asking you to engage. We're not looking to have everyone just be students in a lecture hall, no offense, professors. We want people to be able to directly take action, and we're going to provide opportunities for you to do so. We're going to make them easy for you. And the first opportunity for action is to endorse Climate Safe California. My colleague Nina is going to be putting a link into the chat where you can endorse Climate Safe California and join hundreds of business leaders, local elected officials, and other folks just like yourselves to endorse this policy platform. And in doing so, demonstrate your support for the need to get the state to seriously tackle this climate crisis. All right. So I see that we've got Senator Henry Stern here, and he is going to kick off our first panel. And so I will just provide a quick introduction to him and then hand it off to the senator. State Senator Henry Stern is a sixth-generation Californian and native of his district, which is the 27th Senate District down in Southern California near Malibu. He credits his passion for public service as a family trait, with a diverse history, including farming, ranching, music and film, and a steadfast commitment to helping young people fulfill their potential. Senator Stern was elected to represent the 27th SD in November of 2016. Before that, he has acted as a lecturer at UCLA and UC Berkeley, enjoys volunteering at his local Boys and Girls Club, and is member of the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy Advisory Committee, the Jewish Federation, the American Jewish Committee, and the Truman National Security Project. He's an alumnus of Harvard University and UC Berkeley Law School, and has been one of the preeminent climate champions in the California legislature for the past few years, as well as during his time as a staffer for Senator Fran Pavley. So with that, thank you so much, Senator Stern, for coming and joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Vince. Am I coming through okay?
We read you loud and clear.
All right. Yeah, I see you. All right, there I am. Well, thank you to you and Duran and Ellie, and I see you glossed over my time under the tutelage of Dr. Dan Kammen. I know he spoke earlier, but I've trained with the very best. I was at Berkeley in law school at a time, back in about 2007, right before we elected then Vice President Biden. And, at the time I left Cal when Dr. Kammen went off to, finish writing the IPCC, and Stephen Chu went off to run the Department of Energy, and everything seemed possible. We had elected Barack Obama, and I worked for Henry Waxman at that time. I was his environmental lawyer. At a young age, I sort of said climate change law is going to be where I focus my work. And when we moved Waxman Markey out of the House, it was like, okay, we're just about done here. And I felt the same way when we passed AB 32 with Fran Pavley. It's like, all right, we got the vision. We have a 2030 target now somehow in place. Like, we muscled 40% below 1990 level, took all the political strength we had back 2015. And it turns out we undershot it, and it's going to take a ton more political will than we had then. And that all our ambitions are simply not enough, that they're completely unjust. And it's a hard thing to admit to yourself when you spend your whole life working on climate policy, as I know so many of you do every single day, right? You wake up with the emergency. You don't just hit the snooze alarm like most people who just want to live their lives. Okay, I'm in the middle of a wildfire. Okay, I'm out of the wildfire, hit snooze, go back to my life. Okay, now I'm in a flood, get through that. But you all live in this constant emergency. But then to have to go through the reckoning to say that this isn't a safe or a just target, and that our entire ambition is one that will lock millions, tens of millions of people into an unsurvivable future, literally an uninhabitable earth, as my friend David Wallace Wells said. Where I represent Woodland Hills. I know you mentioned Malibu. That's the tiny slice on the coast. You go in, hottest day ever, 121 degrees last year. But we talked to Dr. Alex Hall last week at a Senate hearing. He said it could hit 130 in this decade. And millions of people in the San Fernando Valley, where I represent, would actually perish in that kind of heat without the grid online and the kind of resources we need to provide local resilience through clean energy. People are going to get hurt here, and the socially vulnerable will be left behind. And so it's a year of great ambition when it comes to, our rhetoric around the budget for investment in climate change. You'll hear a lot in Sacramento about how well we're doing and how much money we're negotiating in a climate resiliency budget. We're going to negotiate $1 billion package. And it sounds like an embarrassment of riches. But I think history will judge us to realize that it's actually, it could be an embarrassment for the state of California if we pat ourselves on the back in this moment and don't set ourselves on a path to net negative emissions on a 2030 or 2035 timetable. And if we don't invest in climate mitigation and resilience at a scale commensurate to the problem. We're talking about $1 trillion problem in California, and we're proposing $1 billion solutions. And we've been flush this year. Our budget's in very good shape despite us all still traumatized and limping and, not fully out of this pandemic. But the state of our fiscal affairs are very strong and we can do more. But the lobby itself has to grow. We do not have the advocacy firepower together right now to get our legislation through at the scale we need. Our bill that we worked on to establish a climate safe California and codify the targets that you all have endorsed and that I endorsed with you, not looking just out of 2045 and a distant future of potential neutrality. I find neutral to be such a neutral concept. We need to actually reverse global climate change. The current levels of heat are unsurvivable. We need to actually turn down the temperature. That sounds crazy, but as you'll hear from scientists and all the policy folks today, it's actually not crazy. You can justly remove carbon. You can turn this ship around. We can drop the heat in Woodland Hills from 121 down 7-8 degrees, those crucial degrees you need to make it through a day, for the grid also to make it through a day, with cool pavement, urban greening, breaking up these urban heat islands. There's actually tools we have in our toolkit, but we're accepting our supremacy as some kind of mantle of pride here in California. And I don't mean to be a downer at the kickoff of your day, but I would just say as Californians, let's recognize that we are a petro state right now with a lot of great climate goals, but that we are the #1 consumer of petroleum on Earth, except for the US, China. I think but as far as among other nations on the planet, 3rd largest on Earth. Germany, India. We talk about the 5th largest economy on Earth, but we're 3rd in petroleum. I think only the DOD is close to us, the entire Department of Defense. And they're changing. But this moment, we have about a month left in the legislative session. We have a bill on the table in the Senate, AB 1395. And they're looking at net negativity and reaching net zero by 2045 at minimum. The governor's called on the Air Board to explore a more ambitious time frame in their scoping plan. I hope that directive goes through, but at this point, if we're not thinking what happens in the next 9 years, in this decade, and we don't actually get beyond zero, I don't think California makes it. I mean, we may not see it in our lifetime, and with those of us who get to live in places with air conditioning and away from a fire zone or out of a floodplain, like, we may be fine. But the fracture socially that we're about to endure, the dislocation, the poverty, the domestic refugees, millions of Californians without a home. You think this homelessness crisis is bad? You wait till climate truly hits. So I don't mean to be doomsaying. I would say, we've got the legislation and the leaders to get this done. We truly need your help, though, to push us and to not accept the status quo as a sort of barometer of what leadership ought to be. We want this Congress to act too, and for climate not to be an afterthought there. But Senate Bill 582 that we wrote with you all, and the 2030 targets, doubling our emissions goals, right? Going from 40% to 80%, radically transforming our economy right now. That's the kind of ambition we need. So I hope you'll all join us and sign on. I see some wonderful remarks in the chat. People like the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Project, just a great local example of people who just saw what was happening outside their front door, did the training, worked with you all, but the grassroots matter. Now you have assembly members in the San Fernando Valley knowing your name, and when you call up on the phone, they get a little nervous and they want to make sure they cast the right vote. You have to make us nervous. you have to be that bug in our ear. You have to make yourself visible and know that you don't have to be a big lobbyist or a high-paid expert. You just have to be yourself in your community with your senator or your assembly member, and to focus on state government and laser focus for a little bit here and help us get some major legislation out of the state of California before we burn this whole thing down. I think it can be truly transformative. I think we can rethink the entire scope of the ambition, and not just targets, but the actual realities of who's benefiting from this economy too. To look at the care economy, to look at social workers as climate workers, to look at IHSS and supportive service people who check on people during a heat wave or during an epidemic or during a power grid shutdown, to bring the SEIUs and all the nurses and form a super coalition here. It's happening in Congress right now between care, immigration, and climate. I think we can form that same alliance in California and change everything. You're going to hear from some great leaders throughout the day. I appreciate being with you all in the opening stages. And yeah, this is a damn emergency, right?
Right.
We're going to do it joyously. We're going to approach it with all of our spirit. But thank you for not hitting snooze.
No, and thank you, Senator, for your passion and your commitment, and for speaking so truthfully about what we're really facing. I mean, at the end of the day, this is probably the challenge of our generation. And so we're very proud to be working with you and all the folks who are here. And I've seen some great comments in the chat. Please stick around for just a few more minutes if you can. We're going to be hearing from a reporter, and then we got some questions that we'd like to direct to you and to Anthony. So, but let's get a little sort of national perspective here. I'd like to bring into the conversation Anthony Adragna from Politico. He's a climate and energy reporter for Politico. He spent years covering the EPA, worked with Bloomberg. He's going to bring us a perspective from Washington, D.C. You know, what's happening there. Obviously, we're part of the country. So I'd like to invite Anthony Adragna to give us a little bit of perspective on what's going on in Washington and implications for California. Anthony, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's so great to be with everybody, and it's such a critical time here in Washington. We're expecting action this weekend on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Democratic leaders have talked about this kind of two-track approach to infrastructure. Infrastructure has become kind of an amalgamous, undefined term, but we're expecting through that to make some significant climate investments that have not been made at the federal level before. So we're working our way very slowly through a 2,700-page bill right now. I think from a climate advocate perspective, this bill is not going to be everything. It's definitely not going to be everything. But there's some notable provisions, nevertheless, that I think it's worth highlighting. So there's going to be tens of billions of dollars that are going to be poured into trying to harden the nation's grid resiliency and building out that infrastructure, making it easier to put new transmission lines in. There's going to be billions of dollars dedicated towards these new emissions demonstration projects, for new sorts of energy. Some of those are going to be things like carbon capture and sequestration that I imagine that advocates are going to be less excited about, but there's also going to be ones on things like energy storage, hydropower. The bill has $8 billion for Western water needs. Obviously, I recognize that the state is going through just a devastating drought at the moment. So that hopefully those provisions will be helpful. There's $3 billion for wildfire mitigation, which would include a pay increase for firefighters out there. And there's also going to be tens of billions of dollars dedicated towards things like energy efficiency and weatherization, things that I've often heard called the low-hanging fruit of climate action. And then after that, obviously the Democrats are going to turn their attention to a reconciliation package. This is a procedural, very inside Washington thing, but it allows legislation to be advanced by a simple majority. Democrats obviously only have 50 votes in the Senate and a razor-thin majority in the House. So they're going to try to unlock this tool after they finish the bipartisan bill, and then they're going to spend several months trying to actually craft those proposals that are going to make up the bones and the meat of that proposal. But that's where a lot of the main climate action is really going to be. We're expecting some sort of a national clean energy standard. The details of that are still TBD. Sheldon Whitehouse told me, Senator from Rhode Island, very big climate hawk, told me probably 6 months ago, immense amounts of this are TBD. And that's how I feel like every single day in Washington is. The process is still, as far along as we are, it feels like there's still miles to go. So I imagine that whatever that clean energy standard ends up looking like, California is going to be really well positioned to either meet or exceed it through existing legislation. We'll obviously see what that looks like. I think a provision that's kind of flown under the radar is in that bill, Democrats are going to be looking to establish a national green bank. That's been called a number of different things, a green bank, a climate bank, a clean energy accelerator, but in effect, it's going to be seeded with tens of billions of dollars. Most proposals are around, have been around $100 billion, but to seed it with public money draws in private investment and to really try to drive the next generation of technologies. There's going to be, Democrats have said they're going to put $10 billion towards a civilian climate corps. The idea being to provide jobs to young people in a host of projects, everything from national park maintenance to planting trees, coastal restoration. So I think that's a really intriguing proposal. It's been something that a lot of progressives here in Washington have been pushing really strongly to try to get included. And it looks like they're going to get at least $10 billion worth of investment. The bipartisan bill that I referenced earlier has $7.5 billion towards the nation's charging infrastructure. I think a lot of Democrats view that as completely inadequate for building out the electric vehicles ecosystem. Obviously, the White House has a big announcement on that today, but I think we should look for this reconciliation package to also have really major investments in electric vehicles. That's something that both Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and the White House have obviously leaned in quite heavily on. They've talked about upwards of $150 billion towards electric vehicles. I don't know if they'll get that far with just kind of the political realities here in Washington, but I would expect significant investments in electric vehicles. Notably, I think tax credits for people to actually consumers to buy electric vehicles, I think is something that's been talked about quite frequently. And then they've talked about two pretty significant, but as yet undefined things, a methane fee, and then also a border adjustment fee. So both of those, obviously, with everything in climate policy, the devil is in the details, but those are two potentially very consequential things that we're going to look for as this package comes together. One other thing I'll spotlight for you all out in California is obviously Senator Feinstein is now the chair of this really important appropriations committee dedicated to energy and water funding. They actually passed a bill just yesterday with record funding for a host of energy and water programs. So I think she actually is really well positioned at this crucial time to be able to steer money and dedicate money to a lot of these programs that are going to play a crucial role, at least federally, in building out a lot of this infrastructure. And so that's where we are here in Washington. It looks like we may get this bipartisan bill across the finish line as soon as this weekend. Democrats would then use this procedure called reconciliation to unlock a majority-only process where they would make these much bolder climate investments. And we would expect that to happen in the next couple of months. Lots of twists and turns along the way. There's obviously a broad ideological spectrum among the Democratic caucus, but that's kind of where we are right now.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you for that great overview. We've had a ton of great questions come in through the Q&A and through the chat. I just want to let everyone know we're not going to be able to answer all those questions, but we do have a few minutes for a couple of them. So I'm going to start with you, Senator Stern. And really sort of this cuts to the core of how we move these ambitious policy goals forward. What are the primary obstacles? Why couldn't we get SB 582 passed? Who are the folks who we need to be most directly pressuring? I'm not necessarily asking you to call out your colleagues, but where can we best direct our efforts to get the bold legislation and policies that we all here today know are necessary?
Yeah, thanks. I would say the oil lobby is probably the primary impediment, and the secondary but perhaps more important impediment is working with the building trades in labor, also a sort of crucial element because there's so much sort of core dependency on oil and gas. Although there are only 7,500 oil and gas workers actually in the state of California, it's a mighty alliance. And I would say that the pitch that I've been trying to make to my colleagues who worry about disruptions, who worry about moving beyond petroleum, right? Who want to know what's going to happen to refineries under an 80% by 2030 scenario, or know what's going to happen to the extractive industry under an 80% by 2030 scenario, or even what's going to happen to our gas generation system, the Scattergoods and the Graysons and the Van Nuys generating stations, the Valley generating stations out there. There's people who work at these places. And I don't really like to talk so much about just transition. I'm much more bullish about no transition at all for a pipe fitter or an electrical worker. I think that what if I'm making the case to my colleagues in the San Fernando Valley, for instance, other senators out in that area are crucial. We have the majority leader in our backyard. We have really important people. Senator Toni Atkins is, the boss and the president of the Senate, and she's the one who's going to really decide what moves or doesn't move at the end. So I'd say the majority leader and the pro tem are sort of the key deciders at this point. But the case, at least I would say, to make to them is if you want to do aggressive new technology deployment, if you want to say convert our refining fleet to something that can produce green hydrogen, or you want to be looking at carbon removal or even storage and sequestration, right? If you were to say take the oil fields of LA and turn them into a sink, and not for enhanced oil recovery, but to actually close wells, but fill them up with carbon, so that concrete itself comes from carbon. Like, we can create thousands more jobs over the next decade in union jobs, not union jobs, like in the trades themselves. So we've got to sort of go through the door they've opened for us. And I'd say that's, if we can't make that labor argument and somehow overcome WISPA and the oil lobby, we unfortunately, a lot of Democrats still pay attention there, and a lot of money moves in Sacramento, and it's not just to Republicans. So we're all a little oily.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And those are some of the keys to getting things done. In that regard, there's been some interesting questions for Anthony. I've got a question for you from Nancy Grove. Should we be worried about provisions for natural gas and nuclear energy in the infrastructure bill? What are your thoughts about that? That's a question that's come through.
I don't know if I would. I'm not going to say worried, but I think those provisions are definitely there. And part of that is just the political reality of the federal makeup of the Democratic caucus right now. As I mentioned before, it's 50-50 in the Senate. It's a couple votes in the House. And people like Joe Manchin, like him or hate him, are there and are going to be advocating for their constituencies and their communities. And so I think that's why you're going to see the investments in carbon capture, nuclear energy. There's a program in the bipartisan bill that is a lifeline to the nuclear fleet in this country. I recognize that's not going to be popular with everybody, but it's unfortunately just part of the reality of divided, Democratic control in Washington, but very slight Democratic control. And so I think they really are pushing at the limits to see what they can get accomplished, recognizing that they have a conference that spans everybody from the Jared Huffmans of the world to the Joe Manchins of the world.
Absolutely, that's great, and thank you for that perspective. Senator, I got one more question for you from the mayor of the city of Millbrae. She mentions, this is Ann Schneider. She talks about insufficient funding for urban greening, and the sort of the conflict between the need to build out more housing and the challenge that we face in addressing the climate crisis. So she says Sacramento spends its time pushing local governments to build more housing, but not giving us tools to help green our cities. So perhaps as your closing comment, what would you say to Ann Schneider and the other local government officials who are with us today about that conflict between housing and cooling?
That we have some hypocrisies built into the current plan for addressing our housing affordability crisis, and we're building not only deeper into fire zones right now where development's totally unsustainable, but also into areas where the heat itself is not going to be survivable. And so unless we have a sort of matching fund or the kind of emergency mitigation dollars at the local level to do this stuff, we're tying one hand behind your back, and I don't think it's going to work. So I would say, you know, we're fighting over too small of a pot in California. We heard the federal perspective; they talk in the billions, you know, for some of these climate programs. But again, in the state of California, $1 trillion liability. So buying that down with $100 million urban greening program ain't going to get us there. So we just had a big hearing on this. You may want to look at our joint legislative emergency management committee and look at some of the impacts of extreme heat and the inequities in that. But I would say we're going to be battling right now. There's a regional climate resilience proposal that Kevin Mullen and I are working on in the budget. He's the majority leader in the assembly. And if you all want to get more involved in that, I think we're proposing about a $400 million fund for local governments to do urban greening and get past extreme heat. So look it up. And there's a bill, I think AB 585 from Luz Rivas, also the hottest part of LA, who she's pushing that too. So those are some good little action items if you want to get more engaged.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for all your knowledge and your passion. And thank you to Anthony. And thank you all of our attendees, the hundreds of you out there who've been peppering us with great comments and questions. I wish we had time to get to them all, but we have so many other great speakers. We are going to have to move on. I will point out, if you put your questions in the Q&A, our staff and possibly Anthony and others might be able to provide you with written answers. But once again, you know, please keep this conversation going. I just want to take a moment once again to thank Anthony for joining us from DC, and thanks Senator Stern for joining us. We really appreciate everything you both do to help move this critical issue forward as we move towards hopefully a climate safe California here in the near future. So thank you, Senator Stern, and thank you, Anthony, very much for being with us here today. As we have so much to cover, I'm happy to move us on to our science panel. And in order to introduce the professors who will be giving us a sense of what we're up against, I'd like to bring on my colleague, the CEO of the Climate Center, Ellie Cohen. Ellie, if you would like to pop on the screen, we'd love to have you introduce the next panel and give us a little sense of really what are we up against.
Thank you so much, Duran, and thanks again to Senator Stern, Politico's Anthony Adragna, and everyone for being here today. As Dr. Dan Kammen and Dr. Manuel Pastor wrote in last Saturday's San Francisco Chronicle op-ed, carbon neutrality isn't enough. We have to go for carbon negative and equity positive by 2030. We need major equitable investments today that will save untold money and lives in the long term. Here in California, we're losing cities to fire. We're losing lives to extreme heat. We are losing the potential of our agricultural base to provide food for us wherever we are. We are in the middle of a climate crisis, but we have incredible opportunities at the same time. Our science panel today will address some of this science around what we're up against and the incredible opportunities if we act soon. I'm thrilled that the renowned professor, Dr. Dan Kammen, is one of our two climate experts speaking today. Dr. Kammen is a distinguished professor of energy at the University of California, Berkeley, among several other appointments. He's worked in both the private sector and public sector, internationally, nationally, and for the state. Dan, we're honored to partner with you as our science advisor to the Climate Center, and so grateful for your visionary climate, energy, and equity leadership. We're also thrilled to have with us today Dr. Daniel Swain on our science panel. Dr. Swain is a highly respected climate scientist at UCLA, focused on the dynamics and impacts of extreme events, including droughts, floods, storms, and wildfires. Dr. Swain, I am really happy to meet you finally, at least virtually. I've been following you on Twitter for a long time and through your excellent Weather West blog since you established it, and really appreciate all that you do. So I'm going to hand it off now first to Dr. Swain, if you can bring up your slides.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. Let me just pull up those slides and I will start sharing my screen momentarily. All right, as long as that's full screen, I'll just get started. I actually have probably a little bit too much content for my 6 minutes, so I'm going to go really fast through this consciously, and then hope that there is some time. Hope that sparks some discussion that we can sort of do some follow up in the Q&A session. So, as mentioned, I study climate extremes, and I think that's what I'm going to focus on today because we've certainly seen a lot of them in California. But first, I wanted to point out something about California, changes in California precipitation that may surprise a lot of people. And that is this.
Sorry, Dr. Swain, it seems that your screen is cut off here. We see part of the slide, but not the whole slide.
Let's see.
And so I'm not sure, Duran or Janina, if you can help to correct this.
Let me try this
There it
now.
is.
Does that work? Great. All right. Sorry about that. What I really wanted to emphasize was something that I think may come to as a bit of surprise to a lot of folks, which is that in a warming climate, California's overall mean precipitation may not change greatly. There's actually not a whole lot of evidence of either dramatic wetting or dramatic drying from a mean precipitation perspective. And yet, at the same time, there's actually quite a strong expectation that the spatial and temporal characteristics of precipitation may change rather dramatically. In other words, despite relatively modest or minimal mean changes in precipitation, we expect to see large increases in both extremely wet and extremely dry events on opposite ends of the hydroclimate spectrum. So really what that means is that we'll see an increase in what we've termed precipitation whiplash, where we swing wildly back and forth between different kinds of extremes. And one of the reasons why California has such a distinctly Mediterranean climate is because we already have a really strong seasonal cycle. So we have very dry summers and usually at least wet winters. But even that aspect of our variability from a precipitation perspective is expected to increase. So we expect to see even longer, drier summers extending longer into the shoulder seasons in autumn and spring, but potentially wetter winters. So we see wetter years and drier years, even drier dry seasons, but potentially wetter wet seasons. You can kind of sense a theme here. I'm getting at this is relevant on a lot of different timescales and for a lot of different practical purposes. And the autumn drying in particular has great relevance for the wildfire crisis that we are seeing in pretty dramatic spades over the past couple of years. And on the other side of the spectrum, so I'll come back to drought in a moment, but I really think that something that's been underestimated is the rising risk of flood in this part of the world. We haven't seen a lot of flood recently, although it is worth remembering that back in 2016, 2017, most of California saw its wettest year on record. This was the same year as the Oroville Dam crisis. We've sort of forgotten about it because we've had so much drought and water scarcity in the meantime. But interspersed there, we did get an extreme wet event. And the reality is that great floods in California are not a mystery. We know that they occur. The paleoclimate record, the newspaper record even has the flood back from 1862, the Great Flood, which caused devastation when it occurred. But of course, at that time, California was only home to hundreds of thousands of people, and it's now home to 40 million people. And so a modern day repeat would be pretty disastrous. Our own work suggests that there is something like a 50-50 chance of seeing a multi-week extreme precipitation and flood event on the order of what happened in 1862 over the next 40 years. So we're not talking about the end of the century, what happens if we burn all the coal. This is just what could happen over the next few decades. And that was really striking to us because that's a pretty big number for something that would be generally pretty devastating. And so I think that overall, the flood risk in a warming climate looms large in a warming climate in California in a way that I think a lot of people are underestimating because we haven't had to deal with it recently. And climate change is likely to increase that kind of risk broadly across the US and the world, but California is actually a hotspot of increasing confluence of physical flood risk and human population exposure to that flood risk. Why? Well, the one sentence version is that we're going to see stronger and moister atmospheric river storms during a narrower but more intense rainy season, as I mentioned earlier. And that raises major questions regarding how California's existing contemporary flood protection infrastructure would fare in a megastorm scenario. We are asking that question right now in a very pointed way in an exercise known as ArcStorm 2.0. Some of you may have been familiar with the original ArcStorm. We're revamping it for a warmer climate in the modern era. So ask me more if you're interested about that. And then thinking about drought, because of course we're experiencing it right now, essentially the most extreme drought in California's recorded history, which comes on the heels of California's previously worst recorded drought in recorded history just a few years ago. What's really striking here is that, as you can see, California's mean precipitation, as I mentioned earlier, hasn't really decreased that much over this period, that mean temperatures have increased quite dramatically, and that the severity and frequency of drought has also increased. So how can that possibly be? Well, what really this is telling us is that precipitation-only drought metrics are becoming increasingly misleading in a warming climate, simply because the same amount of rain and snow just doesn't go as far as it used to. We're getting less precipitation in autumn and spring, but also more winter precipitation and more precipitation falling on fewer days, so more dry days in between. And of course, there's much less snowpack as temperatures rise, and there's more evaporation on those dry days that are coming in between. So all of that put together really means that we're seeing an increased risk of both drought and flood. And when we're talking about drought, we really need to be talking more about the direct effect of rising temperatures, because that is primarily what's driving California's increase in drought intensity and severity. And of course, that has great relevance for wildfires, which climate change is making more intense and more dangerous. And in California, climate change has already more than doubled the occurrence of extreme fire conditions in autumn, similar numbers for the summer season as well. But I think what's important to recognize is that climate change is not so much increasing the number of wildfires in California. In fact, that number is pretty steady or even decreasing. What it's doing is increasing the size, the severity, and the human and ecological impacts of those fires that are occurring. So it's not that we've never seen fire before, it's that we haven't seen fires like this in the modern era. And so to cope with these increasing extremes, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that from a physical science perspective, flexible adaptations are really going to be key. And some specific examples of what I mean by that: can we mitigate the risk of drought and flood simultaneously using something like flood-managed aquifer recharge? Can we fight destructive wildfires with good fire, with prescribed fire and indigenous burning that can reduce the risk of the really destructive events? And so I know I have a limited amount of time, so I'll close with that. Here's my contact information. And if anybody wants to follow up with these things, I think the Q&A session will be a great place to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, Dr. Swain. Really appreciate it. And now, Dan Kammen, if you could bring up your slides, that would be great. And then we'll have some Q&A for both of you.
I can't share screen yet. I need Dan to de-share first.
You should be able to
I think
now.
we're ready now. Yep.
Perfect. Well, it's really a pleasure to get to follow what Dan just said. It's a super pleasure to get to follow the governor, and Ellie, thanks for the intro. And I will really talk about what I would regard as putting what Senator Stern said into practice, this really doubling down on fighting the climate challenge and the racial injustice challenge at the scale that it warrants. And so when we think about the climate transition, we think about kind of nerdy but really useful analyses. This is something that came out of the IPCC work that myself and thousands of others have worked on, highlighting really our path of emissions is part of the story, but the solution science, and it's really what I'll highlight today, is the earlier and the more effectively we start to take advantage of the dramatic drops in cost in solar, wind, energy storage, other technologies, is part of the story. That's the learning we've done in clean energy. But deploying early, so following the aquamarine path, not the red path, means that our annual improvements can be more measured. It's a 3% annual decarbonization path if we could have followed the aquamarine. It's a 5% if we follow the red. And we've never done 5. We've done 3 briefly in the past. Now we know we need to do this for decades, not just for a couple of years. And so to me, the solution science is really mixing what we can evolve on the technology side, what we can evolve on the behavioral side, where we can change on the corporate behavior side, and put it together to take advantage of the new industries. One of them illustrated right here, something the Biden administration, state of California, and the Navy just came together recently to open up offshore wind power in California. The United States is way behind Europe, way behind China. We've now seen South Korea and Japan and the UK and Ireland and others all highlight really large, dramatic goals for offshore wind. California can be a true hub of this. This is a hub of clean energy and potentially clean hydrogen. Views are mixed. We saw in the chat on hydrogen, for example, but this is an opportunity to generate that suite of new jobs. And we're talking potentially about California getting up to a quarter of its energy by the end of this decade from a sector which has zero presence today. Offshore wind is ramping up radically elsewhere in the world. It's an opportunity for us. It's an ecological win, it's an energy win, and it's a massive jobs win. So that's really the landscape of our opportunities and why this is so exciting. And in the op-ed that Ellie was so kind to highlight before, Manuel Pastor and I highlighted the degree to which we not only need to double and triple and quadruple down on these existing areas with solar and wind now the least cost new technologies to install, not just in California, but elsewhere, but also doing nature-based carbon negative solutions, reinvesting in more healthy forests, reinvesting in our coastal wetland areas, in particular, making agriculture climate smart as well. These are all parts of what science can really highlight is a virtuous cycle. Part of that virtuous cycle is recognizing, however, things we've done poorly in the past, using data science and social science on equal measure with the technical side. And I say that as a physicist. And so in some recent work that we did with Google, what we highlighted was using data from 60 million rooftops nationwide, many of them in California, but not all, of course, that what we find is if you look across communities in this country, and we look across a wide range, this is an order of magnitude of levels of household income from below the poverty line, $25,000 a year to $250,000. What we find is that if we look at communities with no racial majority, that's the curve for there. But when we add on communities that are majority, meaning 51% or more Caucasian, we have 30% more solar across income levels. It's not just more affluent white communities. Hispanic, Latinx communities, 30 to 40% less solar across income levels. African American, 50 to 70% less solar. That means that even when deploying these new technologies, we have to overcome a lot of the past barriers. We know, for example, that FICO scores are used discriminatorily ways to keep minorities from home ownership, from accessing condos, from being able to even afford rents. So tying these programs together, and as you heard that at the federal level, there's real attention to this now, but California not only can be a leader, but would benefit dramatically by being a leader in these areas. So in terms of what I would say is the frontier of these exciting new mixtures, here's an example of a project being built with state of California support through the California Energy Commission in the Fruitvale section of Oakland. It is a community mini grid, and you can see all the blue rooftops here that are being equipped with solar, but they're not being equipped with solar on a home by home level. The solar goes on, but all of that energy is stored in a collective block level garage here that repowers the homes and also powers community accessible electric vehicle charging along the roadside. So that as part of the Biden plan to build 500,000 new electric vehicle charging stations, this is an example of not making charging available only for those who have a driveway or a garage, making it available on the street, and you use your smart card to access and charge up your electric vehicle, whether it's privately owned or a zip car, a collective. This is an example of a modular green block. It's more than just a mini grid that we and others believe and are testing out for scaling across California and the country. And it's an example of putting this together. And just to highlight just how dramatic it is, the changes of energy cost, here's a national map with the least cost form of energy today across the country. And you see that while natural gas does have areas where it is still the least cost due to weather and other conditions, solar and wind and even a bit of nuclear are least cost, but this is at $0 a ton carbon. In California, we are at $20 a ton. So if I plug that number in nationwide, you see solar has expanded dramatically, wind is there, gas is being cut back. The Biden administration, however, following work done in California on a so-called social cost of carbon, has requested every federal agency to use this metric. That number is at least $50 a ton. If I plug that into this calculator, you see it's a national map that's transformed. Well, California academic groups, California state agencies are on the lead of using this social cost, which looks at not only the environmental cost, but also the cost in terms of social injustice as a way to bring this out. The Biden plan was announced in January to use the so-called social cost of carbon across all of our federal agencies and to partner with states that also do this kind of justice-based accounting. It dramatically gives us the tools to think through the economic and health and biodiversity benefits of planting trees, of more solar, of these efforts on offshore wind, and allows us to move from that billions to the trillions category that Senator Stern highlighted. If I just kind of sum this up, one thing that we should take real excitement from is that California is not just a national, but a global leader in understanding how we can gather this data on impacted ecosystems, low-income communities. We have a device called CalEnviroScreen, which is essentially tracking tools for environmental injustice. We need to recognize, as was discussed by Senator Stern, that our housing policy is climate policy, not only in terms of the carbon footprint, but in making the lowest income Californians drive the furthest. And that these types of projects that tie in the clean energy transition are ones that we'll only get to if we also work on the social and the justice part of that transition as well. So diversity, DEI, whatever you want to call it, is not an add-on. It needs to be baked into this process because it enables the clean energy transition and enables a much wider recognition. And that's a piece that California can be proud of, having written the bills for. Now we need to make good on it in terms of accelerating ahead. So thank you so much. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Kammen and Professor Swain. Really appreciate all of the great information that you bring. Naturally, as you can imagine, we've had just an incredible array of questions come pouring in. We're only going to have time for a couple, but let me start with this one. If either one of you could address this, but didn't notice either of you mentioned tidal-based electricity, tidal energy. It's something that's been discussed a lot. Suck all the energy out of the Golden Gate. Is that something that you think will be part of the mix? And if so, what are the prospects for that technology? Dan Kammen, perhaps you want to take that first.
Well, I do think tidal will be part of the mix. The challenges are tidal systems are both quite a bit smaller, and they can also often be ones where there's challenges of siting them. But for example, tidal turbines on the floor of the Golden Gate Bridge is a great example. We're seeing these being discussed here. There are active programs to install them in parts of the UK, in French Polynesia, on the Thai coast. So this is definitely a possibility. I would, to be honest, put more stock for California on these larger scale offshore floating wind arrays as large scale, but as opportunities for specific communities, and in particular in some of the areas where you get even more tidal swell than we do, for example, Bay of Fundy, coast of Maine, et cetera. It is definitely part of the mix, but I'll be surprised if that one ends up being a big piece of our energy agenda.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for addressing that. So here's another question, perhaps to do with flood mitigation and energy and how those come together. I don't know if Daniel Swain, you want to take this one, but an interesting question because I know we've seen a little bit on floating solar storage. Someone asked about how efficacious would it be to cover canals and reservoirs with solar arrays to both provide power and prevent evaporative loss of water. Daniel Swain, do you have any thoughts on that particular question?
As a physical climate scientist, I'm really not qualified to answer that. I will say that from an evaporation perspective, it's nice to prevent it in canals, but that's such a tiny fraction of the overall problem, at least from an evaporation perspective. I don't think it's going to help us that much. It's nice to chip away at the edges of things. I don't know how, what the efficiency is from a power perspective, though.
No
I'll
problem.
just add quickly. I mean, I sort of agree with that. We're seeing lots of solar coverings for canals in India right now. It does prevent evaporation. It's open, available space. And so it's great to get the experience and to push more solar out. I do think that we have other areas where we'll likely install more, but it is an example of kind of creative integrating clean energy into our infrastructure.
Wonderful. Well, I want to end with kind of like a bit of a larger question, and then I welcome either of you to take a peek at the Q&A, and if you can answer any of those questions in written form, that would be great. But this is sort of a general question that I think applies to everyone here, but I'm interested in both of your thoughts on this. How can we be so confident that we can meet more aggressive targets outlined, as we discussed, as Professor Kammen just talked about in the op-ed, when we aren't even meeting our current less ambitious state targets? I know this goes to policy and not to physical climate science, but perhaps even just as a climate activist or as a citizen, what are your thoughts on that? If we're not even meeting our current targets, how are we going to get to more ambitious targets? What do we need to do? How are we going to get there?
Well, I'll do a quick one. I mean, Bloomberg New Energy just came out with a major report a few weeks ago that found that the cost to build new solar and wind was less than the cost to operate existing gas and coal. And so when you talk about what's holding us back, it really is the political side. It is not where the technology is. We need to recognize and we need to account for those fossil fuel subsidies. We need to recognize that the jobs benefits are large in terms of the transition. I agree that no individual worker should have to be forced to switch, but the job opportunities go where these new technologies are. And so I think that what holds us back mainly here is not looking ahead at how quickly we can grow elements of not just the clean energy area, but for example, more climate smart farming and climate smart housing. And those are areas that would allow us in our analysis to actually exceed our current goals.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Kammen. Professor Swain, do you have any closing thoughts or comments you want to share with our audience here today?
I think in general, I would agree with Dan. I mean, from a physical science perspective, we're not learning transformative new things about the reality of climate change that really affect the reality of it, the severity of it, or really what we need to be doing about it at this point. We are learning very important new things about how it's going to affect specific regions and how climate extremes are changing in ways that are going to affect very much resilience and adaptation measures. But ultimately, in terms of solving the underlying problem of climate change by bringing emissions to zero, it is at this point a political problem almost exclusively. And that is where the solutions will lie in that kind of domain. So the potential mechanisms to solve the problem already exist. We really need to put them into place now.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for the unique and special perspective that you bring and the expertise that you brought to bear on our conversation here today. Here's the good news. We're actually moving towards discussions of policy. At the end of the day, it's the political forces that will get us to where we need to get to. So I want to thank both professors for being here with us today. As we get ready to move on to our community energy resilience panel. I see Senator Dodd is with us. You're misnamed, I believe, Senator Dodd, that is your assistant's name that's underneath you, but you are Senator Bill Dodd, if I'm not mistaken.
I have been called worse things.
Okay, no problem. Thank you so much for being here. In order to introduce the panel with Kim Wormsley and Jonathan Parfrey and Senator Dodd, I'd like to bring on my colleague, our Southern California community organizer for the Climate Center, Geraldine Lopez Mendoza. Geraldine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Duran, and thank you everyone for joining us with the Climate Center this morning for this exciting and diverse dialogue. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce this panel. I think that as there's been discussion of funds that would be available for clean energy, for renewable energy projects the idea of community resilience centers and community resilience community centers has really come to the forefront. And there's a lot of robust and exciting conversations happening nationwide about what would those centers look like, what would they mean to local communities, particularly disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate impacts. So it's my pleasure to introduce 3 speakers this morning. First, we will hear from Senator Bill Dodd. Senator Dodd is a 5th generation Californian who grew up in Napa, represents part of Napa County, Sonoma County, and several other counties, and is one of the most prolific legislators in the California legislature, having authored 67 bills in 5 years. So we're very pleased to have him with us this morning. We will also be joined by Kimberly Wormsley, who is a council member at the city of Stockton, and her community roots are so deep. She actually is representing in the city council the very area of Stockton where she grew up. And I find that to be very admirable, and her roots are very deep in the city of Stockton. And then finally, we'll be joined by Jonathan Parfrey, who is the founder and executive director of Climate Resolve. Jonathan is both a friend, a colleague, and somebody I admire as a leader on climate and environmental initiatives for decades in the nonprofit and government field. So we have a diverse group of folks here with us this morning to share their expertise and thoughts. And I turn first to Senator Dodd to introduce to us his topic, which I think will be around Senate Bill 99.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. I'm really pleased to be here today to participate in this important conversation on climate and energy resilience in the state of California. This year, I'm proud to be working with the Climate Center on important legislation that aims to provide the tools necessary to foster collaboration between local governments, community stakeholders, and public utilities to develop locally driven resiliency plans critical to meeting our energy and climate goals. SB 99 will create a new technical assistance and grant program administered by the California Energy Commission, providing local governments with the resources to develop clean energy resilience plans that meets the needs of their communities. And we all know that increasing frequency of natural disasters and the utilities use of power safety shutoffs imposes enormous costs on California. Power outages during 2020 and 2019 alone cost California economy billions and frankly impose huge hardships on communities, some of which we're seeing hit year after year. In response to wildfires and power safety shutoffs in my district and across the state, we've seen many homeowners, businesses, and utilities rush to purchase highly polluting backup generators to run critical infrastructure and power community needs. While these generators, have been necessary, it certainly will not help us reach our greenhouse gas reduction and clean energy goals. Now, there's an alternative approach that enhances energy resilience using decentralized, locally produced clean energy. Unlike diesel generators that might only be used a few days a year, distributed clean energy can be used on a daily basis. And while our state's electric utilities have been working to enhance resilience through options available to them, they do not control local public infrastructure like the roofs and parking lots of municipal facilities, places where distributed energy resources could really be strategically located. Because energy resilience is inherently local, building a more resilient system will require that local governments work collaboratively with the utilities to develop plans that meet individual community needs and priorities. This is where SB 99 fills the current void in state policy. It provides local governments with the technical expertise and resources to determine how and where to prioritize energy resilience infrastructure in coordination with the local utility. Community energy resilience plans will outline the strategy that each local government will use to maintain a reliable supply of electricity, a necessary planning step that will make it possible to utilize new state, federal, and private funds for the build out of local infrastructure. This collaboration and planning is a critical step in meeting the very goals recently outlined by Governor Newsom as we look to achieve 100% clean energy electricity system that supports long-term reliability. SB 99 is currently pending on the Assembly Appropriations Committee suspense file. In order to move that bill forward and get to the governor's desk, we need the advocacy and support of individuals and organizations like those participating today. So I look forward to hearing more about climate and energy resilience efforts from the additional speakers here today and to answering any questions. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Senator Dodd. It's really inspiring to hear from you, and your leadership is invaluable to us in the state legislature. And thank you also for sticking around for questions and answers, because I'm sure we'll have many. I'd next like to move to Councilmember Wormsley, again from the city of Stockton, who I believe is going to talk a little bit about the devastating impacts of power loss to our most vulnerable communities. Councilmember Wormsley.
Thank you so much. I'm proud to represent one of the largest areas in Stockton, California. However, this area has been historically marginalized by design and intentionality. Many of my constituents, neighbors, family members, and friends struggle economically. The average income for a family of 5 is $27,000 a year, so you can only imagine. This community is plagued with violence, trauma, and despair. It's an area where many people are just struggling to make ends meet. Earlier this week, a mother of 5 reached out to me about a lingering power outage. She has a beautiful baby girl who has pediatrics, type 2 diabetes. For those who may not know, that requires her insulin to remain at a certain temperature 24/7 and an infinite diet. And the only way that insulin can stay afloat is if it's refrigerated. So you can just imagine how this 5 days of not having power has impacted them. The baby girl's medication is no longer good. Her food is spoiled, and now she called me last night to tell me she's ran out of money to go out and eat with her and her children of 5. Lastly, she brought groceries right before the power outage occurred. So all of her groceries that she brought with her EBT card is gone. While my offices have already deployed resources and services to this young mother, this is one of many traumatic and stressful and disturbing ordeals that many of my constituents have to deal with when power outages occur. It's heavy, it's unacceptable, and it's disappointed. When a power outage occurs, not only in my district, but other disinvested areas, it can be life-altering. Food spoilage, medication expiration, having to live without necessities is emotionally traumatic for many. The lack of transparency when this happens is appalling, and it creates a continuum of trauma between residents and government and systems that are supposed to be established for the people. We're living in historic times, and our country, our nation, is living in a state of reckoning. And unfortunately, many elected government systems continue to ignore the simple cry for communication and innovative change. There hasn't to this date been any type of text, robocall, or communication made directly to this neighborhood. It's unacceptable. It's a terrible pattern that happens way too often, especially in marginalized and BIPOC neighborhoods. We must reimagine safe energy efficiency, clean reusable energy, and climate resolutions for all, not some. This is a human rights issue, and that's why I'm demanding, I'm no longer calling for community energy resilience in my city, because no child should be without their medication. No family should go hungry, and community members should not distrust those in positions to move realistic policy that serves all, not some. Either we accept responsibility for the way things are, or we accept responsibility to choose to change them. And I will give it back to you and wait for any potential Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember, for giving voice to all of the people who live in your district who are suffering from these outages, and for making it real for those of us who are not perhaps living in the same kinds of circumstances. The other thing that I'll mention, I noticed that Professor Kammen talked about in his perspective, his presentation, that innovation is limited when diverse voices are not included in program design and implementation. And I think that very much matches what you're sharing with us today, the needs of the voices to be uplifted, to be part of the conversation as we move into a more robust discussion about community resilience centers. So thank you. Next, I'll ask Jonathan Parfrey, who I believe has a presentation for us, to spend his 6 minutes talking about community resilience and touch a little bit upon a different bill that also is dealing with community resilience.
Thank you, Geraldine. And I'm just so pleased. There are over 300 people on this call. And I just think it's a credit to the Climate Center and its great leadership. And you're in really good hands. Geraldine was being very humble in her opening remarks. I want everyone to know Geraldine Lopez Mendoza transformed Los Angeles. She has done such amazing work over the years. Our port of Los Angeles is 10 times cleaner than it used to be, thanks in large measure to the work of Geraldine. And our friend Ellie Cohen, who I knew so many decades ago, it's scary. And she was the best organizer I knew in the 1980s, and she's just gotten progressively better. And so you're in great hands with Ellie. And last but not least, Senator Stern, who has been behind the scenes at almost each and every great climate bill that's taken place. And it was his bill just last year that put into code the California climate change assessment. So there's some really great leadership here, Senator Dodd as well. And I'm just so pleased to be in your company. And greetings from downtown Los Angeles. I hope you're all having a cool and safe summer. It's been a really tough summer. Just this last June, the month of June, we've had more than 1,200 daily temperature records broken in North America. Yesterday, I was in the city of Paris, Geraldine visiting the CRNR plant, of all things. And it was 110 degrees out there. And this is our reality. And our organization is focusing in on the effects of extreme heat and how people can take tangible steps to do something about it. And they can experience those benefits. And we feel that that's a gateway drug, that once people are excited about making that difference at the local level, then it'll bleed over into other areas to take on greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what we're really excited about, is moving people to be confident in climate solutions. So listen, when it comes to extreme heat, there's only a few things that we can do. There's not an unlimited palette. I'd like to go through a few of them really quickly. First, Mother Nature, planting trees. That is the best answer. And not only do trees provide the shade, they actually capture smog particles and they capture carbon dioxide. It is such a natural answer. And yet there are trade-offs, because trees hold moisture and that can drive up humidity. And because of that, we have to balance it with other strategies as well. And when you're in a drought right now, tree health is a really big concern. And so we also, in Los Angeles, have been innovating on reflective surfaces, where titanium dioxide put in a slurry sealed, microns thick, over the horrible asphalt. And what that does is it bounces the sun's radiation back into space. And so there are cool streets in Los Angeles. We also have cool roofs. LA Unified, by the way, has over 50 playgrounds now that have been colorfully designed with reflective materials to cool those schools down. So there are actually ways of getting at this problem. And just imagine, if you will, pre-industrial times. There are forests, grasslands, prairies, oak woodland, farms, before the advent of modern cities. And the earth at that point reflected about a third of the sunlight that struck it. Third bounced back into space. But today, with our buildings, our streets, our parking lots, and playgrounds, we've laid down this petroleum product, asphalt, which is the detritus. It's the last thing that comes out of a refinery. And then we throw it into our cities, and it's capturing that solar radiation. Over like 95% of the sun's energy is captured by that asphalt. And then it is slowly released throughout the day, not giving the human body and the surrounding environment chance to recover from those extreme heat days. And so our cities, the way we've made our streets especially, are maladaptive. We're actually digging a bigger hole, locking us in to a warming world. And so we believe that we have to at least get to a solar reflectance value of 1/3, bound where we were in pre-industrial times. And I have to admit, there are some trade-offs here as well with reflective material. The stuff requires maintenance. The cool streets get darker with smog and with tire marks, and cool walls could bounce some radiation into an adjoining building, or there can be some glare. And there's the wrong kind of materials that you can use that actually reflect in the ultraviolet spectrum, and that creates more smog. And so we have to be very selective. There are also beautiful physical structures that can be implemented that can provide shade. On the left is that beautiful square in Medina, Saudi Arabia, that provides incredible shade. And on the right, that's a photo from Sundance Square in Fort Worth, Texas. And if they can do it in Texas, we can do it in California. And the trade-off here is that it takes some O&M, takes some cleaning, and sometimes the materials wear down. There are trade-offs. And then there are water features that can help too. You know, water cooling, frankly, is the reason why people flock to the beach on a hot day. It's to cool down. The air blowing over the water makes it cooler. And in LA, it's not unusual for, on a hot day, for people to just jump into the San Gabriel River to cool down. And even 100 years ago, the Angelinos, we built a railroad up into the San Gabriel Mountains. It's called the Mount Logan Railroad. The sort of remains of it are still evident, but it was to get people up into the mountains into a remote canyon so they can cool off right above Pasadena. And so we considered nature 100 years ago as a way of dealing with extreme heat. But I want to tell you something that doesn't work. And you know what doesn't work? Oh, I love this slide too, before I get into what doesn't work. This is a bus shelter that provides shade, and there's a hydration station there. You need water to stay cool. Here's what doesn't work. Cooling centers. No, nobody goes to them. Nobody goes to a cooling center. So it's a hot day. You're going to go out in the sun and you're going to schlep to a cooling center. Nobody goes there. I go to them just to take pictures, and there's never anyone the entire day. There's a wonderful PSA that gets read over the radio. Politicians feel like they're doing something for the public, but are they really doing anything for the public if nobody goes to them? So our organization, and we are talking with APEN and SEHA and other environmental justice groups to come up with a much better idea, and that is resilience hubs. It's a way for an existing community center to open its doors to the public and they're going to have hospital grade HVACs on the roof. They're going to have microgrids with energy storage. And they might even have stored water or an atmospheric water machine that can ensure that the public will be taken care of even when the grid goes down and the water goes down. And we love that idea. Last but not least, I do want to touch on the subject of air conditioners and heat pumps. When it comes to public dollars, it is our view that the best thing that can happen are public solutions. And with air conditioners, it's very atomized. It goes into individual homes, which is great. And some people do need help in that regard. But why don't we use public dollars for public solutions, such as cool streets, better parks, more tree canopy, cool roofs, resilience hubs that help more people as a social response rather than this individuated response. There is a bill, AB 585, by Assemblymember Luz Rivas. We have many co-authors on this bill. This is something that we believe is necessary to coordinate state action on extreme heat. And once we're successful in demonstrating that we can BPEC extreme heat, we feel that that can then translate into greater activism in other climate arenas. And we ask for your support to have that coordination at the state level in supporting AB 585. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And I will yield back the screen.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for those concrete examples of things that are happening in Los Angeles and elsewhere. And frankly, I'm personally offended that we have not put something into place that can beat out Texas. We can do better than Texas. I want to thank the panelists for sticking around. We do have some very good questions that came from some of the participants. And I'd like to share a few of them while we have a little bit of time. One comes from Ann Harvey that is directed to Senator Dodd. And her question is as follows. Local sustainability and resilience programs by cities and CCAs are thwarted by state restrictions on microgrids and PUC measures favoring expensive and dangerous long distance power lines. How can we get the state on board with promoting local solar storage and microgrids? Oh, Senator, you're on mute.
You would think after 16, 17 months, I would have that down, wouldn't you? But seriously, I think that's really critically important. And I think that's something that we need to work with experts, throughout the state of California, on this. I'm not talking about the utility companies, of course, because I don't think they really believe that that's in their best interest. But, working with CCAs, for example, to try to get, some sort of idea of what the art of the possible is there and how that works practically, within the grid, cost effectively, how is it going to be paid for? But it's something I'm really interested in. So if there's anybody out there that, has some plans or ideas on that, I'd certainly like to get together with them.
Thank you. I also have a question for Councilmember Wormsley that suggests itself, obviously, from her position as a local city council member. What is the role of local governments in overseeing and planning for community resilience? And why do you think that role is pivotal? Oh, you're
okay. There you go. So I think that for one, I think that local electives have more accountability than even electeds on the national level, and sometimes state, because we have the more direct contact with constituents and residents. So we're able to hear about the issues and the problems that are on the ground. And I'm so grassroots and so much of an alliance builder, like it's just in my nature. And I believe that as local electeds, that it is our responsibility to reach out to state level electeds to kind of advocate and raise awareness to the issues that are happening on the local level. Now, as for like community resilience energy programs, I think it is our absolute responsibility and accountability to move these programs through local government because it directly impacts the local level residents and community members. So I think it is our complete and utter responsibility to move the resolution and policy. And if there's funding strategy and more support needed on a state level or even national level, I think that it's our responsibility to advocate on that level, if that makes sense.
No, to be advocates, to be the local advocates on the state and national level on behalf of your constituents. No, that definitely does make sense. And that leads to actually one of the questions that I have for Jonathan Parfrey, which is, what do you think is the greatest threat to the success of California climate resiliency programs?
I cannot imagine a worse nightmare scenario than a Republican governor coming in after the recall and kicking out all of the good staff in the state agencies and overturning this climate legacy that a current governor, warts and all, he is still pursuing a progressive agenda on climate change. It goes back to the dark ages under a Republican governor. That is the nightmare scenario that we all have to assiduously avoid, period.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I was seeing that Senator Dodd was agreeing with you with some of his verbal, nonverbal language. So one final question to wrap up. There's an actual interesting question from the mayor of Millbrae, Ann Schneider. It's very practical. So I thought it might be useful to end on this note. Does artificial turf increase heat island effects? Or does it just add more microplastics into storm drains? And I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that point.
Yes, this is Jonathan. I apologize if I'm hogging up the time, but I gotta tell you, fake grass actually has a lower solar reflectance, less albedo reflectivity than asphalt. It gathers more heat than even our streets. And so we find that to be a really scary prospect. And real grass, by the way, is great for cooling. So if we can use recycled water, native plants, those types of things, in my view, are way better than artificial grass.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I know that there are lots of other questions that have come up, but we have run out of time. I want to thank State Senator Bill Dodd, Council Member Kim Wormsley of Stockton, and Jonathan Parfrey of Climate Resolve here in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with all of us today. And I return the floor to my esteemed colleague, Duran.
Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you, Senator, Council Member, and Jonathan, and everyone who's here with us today. We promised you that this would be an opportunity to not just hear from people, but also take action. So I'm now happy to introduce my colleague, Janina Turner, who will give you a couple of examples of things you can do right now to help move forward some of the policies and legislation that we're talking about specifically. And then we're going to take a short break. But first, this is really important. I give the floor to Nina. Nina, what do you got?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Nina, and I want to thank all of you for participating in today's summit. If you've attended any of the other Climate Safe California webinars over the year, you'll be familiar with our Take Action segments. So being here today and listening to the many experts and key policy players is an important way to learn more about how to secure a climate safe future, but taking action is how we make real change happen. So we just learned about SB 99 and AB 585 from our panelists. Now let's take some action. Right now, we're going to ask you to contact your legislators to support SB 99. The bill works to support community energy resilience by empowering local governments to plan to use clean, distributed energy with a focus on prioritizing California's vulnerable communities. You can contact your local reps on the page that I will be sharing into the chat right now. One more time for good measure. And if you click on that link, you will see that we have a pre-written letter that will be sent out to your local assembly member which outlines SB 99 and asks for their support. All you have to do is fill out your basic information on that form and click the Take Action button at the bottom. So this whole process should only take you about a minute or so. A lot of the times it will pre-fill your information. And if it does and you finish a little bit early, feel free to take that link and share it within your networks and get some other people to take action today who are not on this call with us. And as some of you are doing that, I will also talk about our next action. We're going to do something very similar for AB 585. So this assembly bill would create a program to coordinate and enhance the state's existing efforts to effectively address extreme heat. So this time, we'll be sending a letter to your state senator to show support for this assembly bill. So take your time filling out the one for SB 99, but I'll drop this new Take Action link in the chat. And I'll do it twice. And take a moment to fill that out and we'll connect you with your state senator. And if you've finished both already in record time, I just want to say thank you for taking action to support both of these bills. And we'll have more opportunities throughout the rest of the summit to take action. So please stay tuned and I will see all of you later. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. That's wonderful. And for those folks who maybe have not yet had an opportunity to do so, I just want to remind you another way that you can take action today, in addition to the two links that Nina provided, is to endorse Climate Safe California. I see a bunch of you have already done that. Almost 20 new endorsements have come in here already today, and we really appreciate that. I see the panelists for our next panel are joining us. We do just want to give everyone just a couple of minutes. It's been about an hour and a half, so I want to give everybody just a couple of minutes to take a quick break. So we're going to take a short break and be back in just a couple minutes. Senator Skinner, if you could just hang with us for a couple moments. We're going to start right around 11:09 as advertised. But in the meantime, we're going to take a short break, and I am going to show a little video from one of our sponsors just to give you all an opportunity to relax, watch a short video, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes with our panel on natural sequestration. So really excited to do that. So just stick around while I show you this video. So here we go. All right, one second.
This land was built by makers. We came with a fire in our bellies, toiled to build a place to call home. We led movements, sparked innovation. Our strength comes from real people, not corporate giants. From the food we eat, to the air we breathe, to the clean energy that powers our lives. We're makers, but also change makers. Thank you for making a positive change.
Well, thank you all very much. That video was from MCE, one of our sponsors. They're doing great work on energy resilience in low-income communities, as are many of our speakers. Many of our sponsors, pardon me. I'm now happy to move us on to our next panel, which is on nature-based sequestration. And I'm going to turn the moderating duties back to our CEO, master organizer, as it was mentioned earlier, Ellie Cohen. Ellie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Duran, and thanks again to Senator Dodd and Councilmember Wormsley and Climate Resolve Jonathan Parfee for the excellent panel on climate resilience and the great moderation by Geraldine. Great teamwork, everybody. Really appreciate it. I'm delighted to moderate now this panel on nature-based sequestration, on natural lands and waters and working agricultural lands, with their many co-benefits in addition to holding or sequestering warming compounds from the atmosphere. There are all sorts of benefits for us, including clean water and clean air, food security, biodiversity, and community health. And as we said earlier, Dr. Dan Kammen and Dr. Manuel Pastor wrote in last Saturday's San Francisco Chronicle, carbon neutrality isn't enough. We have to go for carbon negative and equity positive by 2030. So to reach net negative emissions means we not only have to cut emissions dramatically quickly, and we have the technology and know how to do that, we also have to draw down more of that warming pollution that we've already put into the atmosphere so that we have sequestration through natural and working lands. It's a critical component that must be vastly scaled up compared to what we're doing today in California. Today, we're going to hear from three fantastic women, starting with Senator Nancy Skinner, a longtime environmental trailblazer and co-founder of ICLEI, Cities for Sustainability. She's currently chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee, and she is the lead author of Senate Bill 27 on carbon sequestration to establish state goals on natural working lands and a registry of those projects. Second is Gianna Amador, co-founder and policy director at Carbon 180. Gianna has a broad perspective on how nature-based sequestration fits into California and US climate policy. Welcome, Gianna, glad to have you with us. And Jeannie Merrill of CalCan, California Climate and Agricultural Network, CalCan's policy director since its founding in 2009. She'll be speaking on AB 284, which is part of the California Global Warming Solutions Act update to establish climate goals for natural and working lands. So first, I'm going to give each panelist a couple minutes to make introductory remarks about the critical role of nature-based sequestration to an equitable climate-safe future. I'll pose a couple questions and then we'll go to general questions from our over 300 attendees. So we'll start with Gianna on the big picture. Many in the environmental justice community are strongly opposed to carbon capture and storage, as well as direct air capture technologies. What is your stance on these, and how do these relate to nature-based sequestration and our urgent need to accelerate climate action at scale?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Ellie, and to the Climate Center for having me today. Really excited to be on this amazing panel and to chat a little bit more about nature-based carbon sequestration. And Carbon 180 was really founded on the climate math and this sort of foundational fact that in order to meet our climate goals, we needed to not only just reduce emissions very quickly and drastically, but also to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and to do so at a pretty big scale. So the science estimates that in order to meet our 2 degrees target, we needed to remove around 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by 2050, which, to give you sort of a ballpark estimate of what that actually means, it's about a quarter of our total global annual emissions today. So it's a pretty significant number, and we need to really drastically ramp up the amount of carbon that we're storing, both in our land-based systems and through technologies, really in order to meet the scale of the challenge. And I think the good news is that we can get started with nature-based solutions today. And they're already a really powerful tool that uses photosynthesis to capture and store carbons across our forests, across our wetlands, and across our agricultural lands. So today, those ecosystems in the US store about an equivalent amount to 10% of our US annual emissions. And we need to really focus in sort of the next decade on increasing that contribution and protecting the existing sinks. One of the challenges that comes with nature-based solutions as opposed to tech-based solutions, like you mentioned, Ellie, like direct air capture, is that they're really under the threat of climate change. As temperatures increase, as wildfires increase, we see that those sinks can actually become sources. And so we really need to focus on protecting those sinks, increasing the carbon sequestration, and also making sure that we're investing in sort of the co-benefits and all of the community and ecosystem benefits that come with these solutions.
That's great. Thank you so much. Senator Skinner, I'd love to give you a couple minutes to introduce the work that you're doing on nature-based sequestration. Are you here? Let's see. I believe that
You're muted.
are. Oh, you're muted. There you go. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah.
Certainly. Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Climate Center, for sponsoring this, for hosting this, but also for being the key sponsor of my bill, SB 27. And as we just heard, the potential for, well, not only the necessity for sequestration and the quantity that we must, carbon that we must pull out in order to not have the worst effects of the climate crisis, which is already underway, is clearly been laid out. Now, we have other threats besides the heat to our forests or grasslands and such, and the fires. We also have habitat loss. So habitat loss is a really serious, we look at the Amazon, the rainforest, other, whether it's Indonesia because of palm oil fields and such. So then what that says to us is obviously we have to do what we can there. But in the meantime, we have working lands, our agricultural lands, for example, and in our open space, we have in California, we have much open space preserved. We have grasslands, we have wetlands. All of those have great potential for sequestration if they're managed properly. So our soils, so far we've heard about the photosynthesis, but the organisms in our soils, the more alive our soils are, the healthier that soil is, and the more carbon sequestration capacity it has. And so what my bill does, well, I can get into what my bill does later if you want, rather than now. I can just do the opening part. But the point being is that if we send the right signals to our land managers to manage their land in such a way that it maximizes the carbon capture and storage, then we are going to have a very effective tool in our toolkit on this climate crisis.
Yeah, well, thank you, Senator. And actually, it'd be great for you to give a little overview about SB 27 and why you think it's critical for this to pass this year. Certainly.
Now, as everyone knows, California has really ambitious climate protection goals, first articulated in AB 32, but subsequently in SB 32 and more. So we have very, very specific goals that the Air Resources Board must meet, and they must develop a scoping plan to do that. And that scoping plan identifies where, what actions California is going to take and where we're going to achieve that carbon reduction. So what my bill, one of the first components of SB 27 is to direct the Air Resources Board to include carbon sequestration, which has not been included to date in the next update of the scoping plan. So that's one issue. Second issue is to direct our Natural Resources Agency to basically develop a plan for carbon sequestration within our working lands. So what are the policies that we need and what's the plan? And then finally, it's to direct our OPR, our Office of, that's in the, OPR's Office of Planning and Research within the strategic, well, I forget their name, but anyway, it's within the governor's office, and it oversees a lot of our sustainability plans. So the direction there is that they should develop a registry, because you have many, many more private sector companies now since the Paris Accord who have set goals for carbon neutrality or carbon reduction, either way, but for which they could invest. There's a motivation for them to invest in carbon sequestration projects. Now, if you don't have, we want such investment. We want to encourage private sector investment, but we do not want phony, we don't want greenwashing. So if we had a registry for projects that actually achieved real sequestration, then we could have confidence in those private sector investments and somewhere for the private sector to point to. So that's the purpose of the third component of SB 27, to have our OPR office develop a registry. So those are the three key components of the bill.
Oh, thank you so much, Senator. And
Sure.
I want to give a little bit of time here to Jeannie Merrill, the policy director at Kammen. Welcome, Jeannie. It would be great if you could give a little introduction and talk some about AB 284.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Ellie. And wonderful to follow Senator Skinner, who's been a real leader on these issues, and really appreciate her work in this area. Kammen, the California Climate and Agriculture Network, we are a coalition of sustainable and organic agriculture organizations. We've been around since 2009. And as a way of just brief background, we got started as a network of farmer leaders out of concern for climate change impacts on California agriculture. California, as you know, is the largest agricultural state in the country. And wanting to forward sustainable agricultural solutions to the climate crisis. And I think really sort of building off of what Senator Skinner had to say and what Gianna had to say in terms of the potential for carbon sequestration. Farmers are on the front lines when it comes to climate change, whether it's extreme drought as we're experiencing now, wildfires, heat events, etc., new pests and more. Farmers are very aware that climate change is making the business of producing our food and fiber much harder to do. And California has been a leader in developing agricultural solutions to the climate crisis. We have a suite of state climate smart agriculture programs, from healthy soils to the state water efficiency enhancement program and more. And these are programs that really recognize the multiple benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing carbon sequestration, and with that, improving air and water quality and biodiversity on our farms. And one thing that we saw last year, the pandemic hit, most farmers lost 50% of their markets overnight. And at the same time, the state's latest round of funding was available for Healthy Soils, which provides financial and technical assistance for farmers to make a difference and to change their soil management practices, to reduce emissions and increase carbon sinks. And we thought, we're done for. This is, the pandemic has upended everything. And we were greatly surprised to find that over 600 farmers still applied to the state Healthy Soils program, many more than we could possibly fund. And that's because, yes, they care about climate. Yes, they care about how they're being stewards on the land. But bottom line is Healthy Soils programs also help with the bottom line of farmers. And it's that combination of benefits that's really important. And AB 284, which is authored by Assemblymember Robert Rivas, co-authored by Senator Nancy Skinner, would build upon this work. We still don't have in the state, even though we've done lots of great innovations with the Climate Smart Ag programs, we lack that overall framework. How can we collectively move natural working lands to be not sources, but real sinks, and be important contributors to meeting our goals around carbon neutrality and more? Definitely agree with them more on that with Ellie and others. You know, AB 284 is an important bill because it would require the Air Resources Board to come up with targets, climate targets for natural working lands in the scoping plan, as we've talked about before, and to have interim milestones, and to develop robust tracking of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration from natural working lands, the tools that we need to really be able to better characterize what's happening on the landscape. And to develop in collaboration with sister agencies, Department of Food and Ag, Natural Resources, et cetera, a plan, a framework for how we get to our natural working lands being ultimately sinks when thinking about emissions.
Oh, that's great.
We lack that in California, and that's what 284 would do. It has stiff opposition, I'll just be clear about that. And I think we'll talk about what's needed to sort of get the bill over the finish line. We've been able to get it this far, and there's more work to be done.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that. Thank you, Jeannie. Excuse me. Gianna, if you could give us a perspective from Washington, and I know you know both California and a federal policy on this, how aggressive can we be on our goals? We clearly are in a climate crisis now, and we're past apparently some tipping points that we're seeing all over the globe and here in the West and in California, with very dire circumstances for people literally this minute here in our state. And so what is it that we're going to do to accelerate these kind of timelines on climate action, on sequestration? What are the programs nationally that can help us in California to do more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just been an amazing year, you know, both I think around climate change and in particular around carbon sequestration at the federal level. I think we've seen a real ramp up in both the recognition and action on carbon sequestration. For example, the Biden administration has really worked to embed carbon sequestration again across both tech-based solutions and land-based solutions in the president's budget, in his innovation commitments in ARPA climate. And so we're really seeing carbon sequestration in the land sector being embedded in federal funding from the Biden administration. And even in the most recent Senate infrastructure package, a really big investment in using in better managing our forests, protecting them against wildfires, and beginning to restore forests that either have been previously deforested or have been sort of destroyed from wildfires. And so I think at the federal level, we're seeing a lot of interest, but we really need to ramp up federal funding. I think one, around research development and demonstration in this space, drastically ramp up research at the USDA on soil carbon sequestration in particular, and two, really invest in the conservation programs that are extremely popular for farmers. And I think just many of the points that have already been made on these panels, programs like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Conservation Reserve Program, a lot of these big farm bill programs provide financial and technical assistance for farmers to implement these practices, and can be a really good pair for things like the California Healthy Soils programs to provide more funding for farmers to really implement practices that build soil health, help protect against drought, and also store carbon in soils. So I think those are some of the big programs on the agriculture side, as well. I think investing in a number of the US Forest Service programs, and I think in particular around urban forestry can be really impactful, as well as sort of broader forest management programs. So I think the key here is just a lot more funding. And in the land sector side, I think we're fortunate to have a number of programs that are sort of ready to go, ready to hit the road. And it's really just about directing more federal funding to those spaces.
Well, that's great. We're glad to have you in Washington on our behalf. And there's no question we need a lot more funds, like even with our Healthy Soils program here in California. As Jeannie said, there's a lot more people interested in subscribing to it than money and resources that are available. And we're talking about tens of thousands of acres that are being treated right now in a state of 104 million acres, where we should be treating 20 to 25 million acres. We need to do it on a much bigger scale, much sooner, to make a difference for all those co-benefits that you just described. So thank you very much. Senator Skinner, I know you're incredibly passionate about nature-based sequestration. The first time we met, you said very strongly, that's the single most important thing for us to do. I'd love for you to expound on that a little bit. And also there are some concerns that have come to us about Senate Bill 27, particularly around the registry concept and potential for it to turn into an offset that will still allow greenhouse gas emissions to be polluting our climate. How do you respond to that?
Well, so first, why is this so important? So we've already heard Gianna gave us many, many reasons. When the discussion of what the federal government has done, our own national laboratory, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, has done some great research that shows that the storage, the sequestration from natural lands is the most cost-effective way to, as a carbon solution. It is the least expensive. So given that we know that we've got to do a massive amount of more work, and obviously investments in this area have been hard to come by. And I mean, in this area, I mean, on any climate protection, we're talking about a full economic transition to get off fossil fuels, which we have to do. And of course, with habitat preservation, why do we have loss of habitat? It's economically driven. So we have so many economic factors that the least expensive ways are ones that we should be pursuing. Absolutely. And our working lands, carbon sequestration, and our natural lands is one of the best ways. So on this issue of the fear that a registry could create, whether it's double counting, greenwashing, whatever you want to call it. I mean, obviously, that is something the registry is going to have to grapple with and design in a way to minimize that. And so far, we've been fortunate in most of California's actions to minimize. Not perfect, nothing's perfect, but that's the objective. But to stop it purely because of the fear would be an error. Now, when we talk about healthy soils, I have fought every year to make sure that we have funding for healthy soils in the budget. And it has not been easy. There's a lot of skeptics around the program. So we do still have funding. We secured it again in this 21-22 budget. But if we can have private sector investment in those farms, those ag lands that are willing to apply the healthy soils principles, all the better. Because some of the reason that some ag lands are not is because they say, well, this is more expensive. Now, it's initially perhaps, changing your practice to it might require some capital investment, but over time it is not more expensive and it produces better yields. But if we need to get over this hump of the initial investment and there's private and sector investment that we can tap, then all the better. And with the Healthy Soils Initiative, then we can at least begin to, and this is where Assemblymember Rivas's bill is really a complement to my bill. The more that we can secure ag lands that are actually following a protocol that we know with confidence is sequestering carbon, then the more we could rely on then that private sector investment to keep it going and to get new ag lands in the program.
Well, thank you, Senator. Quick question for
Sure.
Jeannie, then I have a question for all of you. Jeannie, it seems like our huge challenge is the Farm Bureau and some other log jams in Sacramento from the ag industry, yet all of you have described benefits to the ag industry from implementing these kind of practices. How do we overcome that to enact the laws that we need?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that there's diversity there in terms of Farm Bureau chapter and state politics. We do, for example, see support from Farm Bureau for programs like the Healthy Soils program. The Farm Bureau is currently opposed to AB 284, which is unfortunate. And that really has to do out of fear of, by setting a target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing carbon sequestration from agriculture and other natural working lands, the fear for Farm Bureau and others is that will ultimately lead to farmers being regulated in terms of their GHG emissions. And we think that's just completely impractical. We don't foresee that coming. And that if we don't have a goal and a framework, then there's really, it limits the state's ability to scale up this work, which is of course what we need to have happen. So there are ongoing conversations with Farm Bureau and others about that. I feel cautiously optimistic that we'll make some progress on AB 284 on those issues. And we have in the past been able to work with Farm Bureau quite effectively on issues around on-farm renewable energy and more. So it's not, there is a Venn diagram of overlap there, and that's what we look for.
That's great. So I'd like to ask all of you with short answers, and we'll get to Q&A from everybody else. Once we get these two bills passed and signed into law this year, which I'm hopeful we will, what else needs to happen in terms of state policy to ramp up nature-based sequestration as is required by the climate crisis? And what are the most critical new policies that we need to work towards in the next 12 months? Maybe I'll start with Senator Skinner.
So I think right now, SB 27 and Assemblymember Rivas's bill are the two things that we really need. We've got, as I said, in the budget, we were able to fund the Healthy Soils program. We still have not adopted yet our greenhouse gas reduction fund. But all the details of it, we'll do that sometime in August. But I think this direction to our agencies that are doing scoping plans, that are setting the regulations, that are, we need the infrastructure right now, at least in California. So I think those are the next best steps.
Thank you. Jeannie.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the importance of getting legislation through, and certainly look forward to, in August, hammering out the details of the budget. I think we remain concerned that it's been tough to come up with adequate long-term multi-year funding for the climate smart ag programs. So I think we're cautiously optimistic that we'll see some good work happen in August. There have been discussions about the need for a longer term climate resilience bond. We're part of AB 125, which would put a bond measure on the ballot to fund economic recovery and climate resilience in the food and farm system. And that's simply because we're in it right now, our programs are defunded. Healthy Soils doesn't have any money. And so this sort of boom and bust of funding at the state level is really difficult when working with farmers to have long-term projects and to make the case to them it's worth these investments, because they're also taking on new risks when they do these kinds of projects. So my hope is that, yes, let's get this big surplus budget done, but then we need to have a longer conversation about long-term funding so that we can scale up and build some momentum.
Okay, thank you. I see, Senator, your Zoom is cutting out. Can I ask you one other question that came in, and then I can ask questions to Jeannie and Gianna? With the CARB scoping plan, apparently it's not including pesticide-free healthy soils in 2022 because the plan that takes too long. Is there a way for you in your role in the legislature to get CARB to include organic farming and preference for organic food in universal school food programs?
Well, all right. So first off, we have a preference for California food in our school food programs. And our California food program has been working with a lot of school districts up and down the state to make relationships with farmers. And majority of them so far have been organic farmers, though that has not been it's not been required, but that's what the result has been, which is great. Now on the scoping plan, that's why I included in SB 27, the direction for ARB to include carbon sequestration in the scoping plan, and especially for natural and working lands in the future. And obviously organic farming, it's a no-brainer. And so hopefully they would do that. I can't rush my bill, so I can't affect this particular update, but would certainly in the future would enable this. I mean, I certainly can communicate to CARB, which I will. However, that's why I'm carrying SB 27 in order to give that direction.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your outstanding leadership. And if you have one more minute of anything you want to share before you leave.
No, other than I really appreciate the Climate Center, and I appreciate all the work, all of your interests, those who are both participating in this panel and observing it in this very important topic. And I look forward to continuing to be your strong partner.
Thank you so much, Senator Skinner. Really appreciate your being with us today.
Certainly.
So, Jeannie and Gianna, we have another question here. How do you define working lands?
I'm happy to take that.
Please.
Yeah, working lands means that the land is part of producing food, fiber, timber. So it includes agricultural lands, croplands, rangelands, forest lands where there's commercial production.
Okay, that's great. Another question for both of you. What do we do about cattle and their greenhouse gas emissions? Who would like to address that first? Gianna, go ahead.
Who got off mute first?
Yeah, I can kick us off. I'm sure you'll have more to add.
Yeah.
I mean, I think really when we're thinking about the climate crisis, it's about adopting holistic solutions. And so nature-based carbon sequestration is one piece. And we know that there are ways of grazing cattle and livestock that can actually store more carbon in our rangelands. We can also plant native grasses, incorporate agroforestry, and all of those things together can really help improve the climate footprint of the meat that we eat, or the dairy products or the animal products that we're consuming. So I think thinking about it from a really holistic perspective and working with farmers to adopt the solutions that we know already exist is just going to be sort of the next step to decrease the footprint of that industry in particular.
Yeah, thank you. Jeannie, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just briefly add that California a few years ago created the first alternative manure management program, which is really targeted at reducing methane emissions from the storage of big manure lagoons, which we have plenty of in California. And what's exciting about the alternative manure management program is that we have, again, more dairies than funding who have been applying for those projects. And it's all about moving from that wet manure that produces lots of methane and is problematic for air and water quality reasons as well, to dry manure handling and storage and composting. And compost is a really beneficial product that we need for healthy soils when we're talking about that. So the demand is really high for AMP. Again, that program has been defunded, and so we're hoping to restore funding for it. And it's become such a model that there's a proposal in Congress to create a federal version of the Alternative Manure Management Program under the Agricultural Resilience Act. So there's lots of innovations, and we can have sustainable livestock in a way that also provides benefits.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite both of you for just any wrap-up comments in terms of nature-based sequestration and policy for us here in California.
I'm happy to go.
Go ahead, please.
Whoever can get off mute first. We're at this sort of very critical juncture, as I think the Climate Center, you make so clear where we are. And if we think about nature-based solutions as a retirement account, we are woefully underfunded. And we will not be able to retire this climate crisis unless we start investing now, and that we scale up this work and make a difference now. And it's quite clear that there's increased attention to these issues in California, which is great. But we need state budgets to reflect that. We need the scoping plan to reflect that. We need these various framework documents that will be coming out of the administration to reflect that. And so now is an opportunity. There are many opportunities for people to get engaged. This is a really critical time. We can make a real difference, but we've got a very short window to do that.
Thank you, Jeannie, so much. Gianna.
Thanks so much. I think I completely agree with Jeannie that we're at this sort of critical inflection point, I think for two reasons. One, climate change is happening and we have a short window to make an impact, but also because our farmers and foresters are in crisis. And so I think we really need to think about smart investments, both at the federal and the state level, that can sort of address those dual challenges. And at Carbon 180, we think about, three big barriers for nature-based sequestration: science, incentives, and technical assistance. And I think states in particular can do a really good job of providing very regionally specific technical assistance and demonstration trials that really support farmers and ranchers and foresters in adopting practices that make sense for their geographies. I'll also say states like California have often been leaders in these on climate action. And so the extent to which we can use California policy as a laboratory to export to the federal level can be extremely powerful. We've seen that on a number of different programs related to the energy sector, and I think we can do it again for land-based solutions. So I think now's the time, and excited to see so much momentum behind it.
Thank you so much. Yes, as we say, as goes California, goes the world. And it's absolutely true, and we need to do more and set that example. So thanks for a fantastic panel and for all your great work, Gianna Amador, Carbon 180, Jeannie, Merrill, Calcan, and to Senator Skinner. Thank you all so much. I'm going to hand it off now to Janina Turner for taking action on SB 27 and AB 284. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Hello again. If you've recently just tuned into the summit, my name is Nina, and I'll be sharing some action items that we're all going to take during the webinar. So if you haven't done so already, now is a good time to endorse our Climate Safe California platform, and I'm dropping a link in the chat there. So that's our first item of action. But so far, as we've learned in our panel, SB 27 allows the state to scale up investments in carbon sequestration on natural and working lands, which is an important step towards delivering natural climate solutions and securing a climate-safe California. So our action for this bill will be showing support by contacting our local assembly members through the next link that I will share in the chat here. I'll do it twice for good measure. So much like our previous actions, we'll fill out the form that's just asking for some basic information. And then you'll click the Take Action button towards the bottom of the form to submit our letters. It's a fairly simple process. It should only take you a minute or so. So if you do finish relatively quickly, feel free to share that link out with other people who might not be here on this call. That way we get more people to take action today. And as you're doing that, I'll explain our next action, which is for Assembly Bill 284. 284 establishes a pathway forward to accomplish ambitious climate goals by implementing practices that reduce carbon while supporting natural and working lands. So I'm going to now drop that link in the chat. Again, it's the same process. It'll be a similar page just as the one you visited. This time we'll just be taking action for this Assembly Bill. So again, fill out that basic information there and click the Take Action button at the bottom. I know I gave everyone 3 actions to take just now, so feel free to take a minute to do those. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to pass it back to Duran, who will lead us into our next little section. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Ellie, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists. We're just going to take a couple of minutes here before we launch into our next segment. I see our speakers are with us, but we're just going to give a moment or two here. We're scheduled to start at 11:48, and I'm happy to say that we're on time. So think of this as a little break. If you need to get up and stretch, breathe a little. We've been here for a couple of hours, a lot of us. It's been wonderful. I just want to thank everyone who's taking the time to follow up on the action items. We will have another action item related to mobility at the end of the next presentation. This is really the key to what we're doing here. At the end of the day, information is useful, but putting that information to work and actually influencing policy is really what the Climate Center is all about. And Climate Safe California requires a sort of a comprehensive suite of policies, which is why our policy summit today is covering these various areas in detail. So thank you all. Also, just a reminder and a thank you to all of you who have endorsed Climate Safe California. Many of you had done that during previous webinars or in previous interactions with our organization. I would remind you that you can endorse Climate Safe California as an individual, which many of you has done, or on behalf of your organization, your business, your nonprofit. Some of you have done that also. Please consider doing so if you have not. And lastly, I'll just echo what Nina said about the action items. If you believe, as we do, that Climate Safe California and getting to net negative emissions by 2030 is as critical as we all know it to be, please consider sharing that through your social media networks, to your colleagues, to your family, to your husbands, wives, partners, children, parents, anyone else who cares about this as much as we do. We hope that they will also endorse Climate Safe California. The more people join the 1,300 or so folks and organizations who've already done so, the more powerful our voice will be in Sacramento. So I want to thank you for that. And that's the end of my riff. That's the end of our break. I'm now going to turn it back to our government affairs manager, Vince Wartmaja, who's going to lead a panel on sustainable mobility. So Vince, I'm going to give it to you. And I believe you're going to have us watch a video early on from a senator. So I'm ready to do that whenever you are.
Indeedy do. Thank you, Duran. Howdy, everyone, again. So this panel is going to be on sustainable mobility. As we all know, the transportation sector represents a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as criteria air pollutant emissions, aka noxious gases. According to the ARB, the transportation sector represents the largest share of GHG emissions in the state at about 40%. So given that, it's critical that we decarbonize this sector. There's a lot of activity going on in this area, but this panel will look specifically at this sector through the lens of a bill called SB 726 by Senator Lina Gonzalez. In one sentence, the bill will modernize the California Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program by incorporating the latest state environmental goals, as well as having it better reflect technological developments and market trends in the clean transportation industry. Before I turn over and have the panelists introduce themselves, we've got a video from Senator Gonzalez, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it today, but she will help set the stage for this discussion. Duran, let's hit it.
Hello, I'm State Senator Lina Gonzalez, and I'm proud to represent the 33rd Senate District, which includes my hometown, the city of Long Beach, and Southeast Los Angeles. I'm also proud to be the very first Latina chair of the Senate Transportation Committee and chair of the Select Committee on Ports and Goods Movement. I'm excited to join you all today for the Climate Center's 2021 Policy Summit to discuss Climate Safe California and charting a new course for net negative emissions by 2030. Putting on my hat as the chair of transportation in the Senate, I want to stress that in order to make headway towards reducing carbon emissions in California, we need to get serious about reducing emissions from the transportation sector. Currently, the transportation sector, as we all know, is the single largest source of CO2 emissions in the state, with transportation accounting for over 40% of statewide carbon emissions. In addition to these emissions, vehicles are also a major source of pollutants, including nitrogen oxides and particulate matter that are harmful to human health. Because of historically racist policies, our transportation system, like our freeways, highways, and most congested areas, are predominantly located in disadvantaged and underserved communities. In my district alone, we have the I-710 corridor, which is a major trade route connecting goods from the ports of LA and Long Beach to the rest of the state and the nation. This trade corridor is critical to goods movement, but it also runs alongside predominantly Black and Brown communities, polluting those communities and putting people's life and health at risk. This example of my district is seen all across the state though, and a study from the Union of Concerned Scientists has found that on average, African American, Latino, and Asian Californians are exposed to dangerous particulate matter, exhaust from cars and trucks at levels 43 to 20% higher than white Californians. These pollutants increase the risk of respiratory illnesses and cancer. While the transportation sector currently represents a huge source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, it also represents an immense opportunity for us to advance policies that promote both environmental and climate justice. Over the last decade, we have seen the development of new clean transportation technologies and major advancements from cleaner, greener, light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles and infrastructure that reduces both air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. To continue to advance these clean transportation technologies in a strategic yet equitable way, I have authored SB 726. This bill charts a course towards sustainable transportation and allocates state dollars towards more equitable clean transportation investments. This also requires state agencies to develop a sustainable transportation strategy, an interagency collaborative strategy that will identify and develop new steps and achieve emission reductions for the transportation sector as a whole. SB 726 will also modernize the existing clean transportation program in California to ensure that at least 50% of funds will go towards projects that are in or benefit disadvantaged and low-income communities. With measures like SB 726 tackling emissions from the transportation sector and other measures on energy resilience and carbon sequestration, we can create a multifaceted, holistic plan and approach to achieve our robust climate goals with equity in mind first, like negative emissions by 2030. By advancing these types of legislation that are equitable and innovative and data-driven, California will continue to be a global leader in combating climate change. I believe it. It has been a pleasure to join you all here, and thank you to so many of our stakeholders who have been at the table for so long. We appreciate you. Thank you very much.
All righty. So now that we've had Senator Gonzalez at the table for us, let's go ahead and have our panelists introduce themselves. Bill, do you want to go first, and then we'll do Meredith? Then you can each have about a minute or two to introduce yourselves and your organizations.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill McGavran, the Policy Director with the Coalition for Clean Air. We're a California nonprofit. Our mission is to improve air quality, prevent climate change, and protect public health. You can find out more at our website, ccair.org. And I want to thank the Climate Center for bringing us all together today, and also for the great work that you're doing. I especially like the action orientation.
Thanks, Bill. Meredith?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay, Vince. Meredith Alexander, I am CalStart's Policy Director. CalStart is a member-based 501c3. We have over 280 member companies and all across the clean transportation spectrum, So it includes automakers, parts suppliers, EV charging providers, fleets like transit districts, and other nonprofits are also members of CalSTART. So we're really a Big 10 organization, and our goal is to transform the transportation sector and reduce those 40% of emissions in California that are coming from transportation. So we work on vehicle policies and also off-road port equipment policies as well. And yeah, I've been with CalSTART for 2 years. Just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed the discussions this morning. And for those of us focused on reducing emissions, obviously it's a huge task, but I think I'm always very nervous about climate adaptation and what we're doing on the carbon sink side of the equation. And so really exciting to hear some great updates today on how we can deal with urban heat islands and how we can sequester carbon. So thank you so much for the great discussions.
Thanks, Meredith. And let me just say on a personal note, I've worked with both Bill and Meredith for years now, and they're some of the best in the business. So I really appreciate you guys being here and joining us. So let's go ahead and dive into SB 726. And we'll just go ahead and do this as a Q&A. Meredith, as the sponsor and one of the primary proponents of SB 726, can you give us a little bit of background on the Clean Transportation Program, as well as what you see the bill doing to help make it better?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so this bill is really focused on the Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program, which before recently was fondly called ARF-VTP, the Alternative and Renewable Fuel Vehicle Technology Program. So thank you to the Energy Commission for making that acronym a little bit more manageable for everybody. And that program has been around for over 15 years. It's been a critical element of our state's transportation and climate programs. And one key defining factor is that it's always been technology neutral. And to date, it has put a lot of state funding into vehicle and fueling technologies. And it's actually funded through DMV registration, or the fee is collected through DMV registration. So all Californians are supporting this program. And right now, you know, the focus of the program has shifted as the availability of alternative fuels has really shifted to zero emission fuels. The program does have guaranteed funding right now. You know, basically the only carve out in the program is for light duty hydrogen stations, because the state had previously established a goal around that. And then in recent years, we've seen the Energy Commission moving, you know, almost all of the funding to zero emission fueling and EV charging. And so one of the biggest components of the Energy Commission's program today is something called Cal EVIP or Cal EVIP, which is a light duty passenger car EV charging program that started in different regions, but is now going statewide. So that complements other utility programs to build more DC fast charging, to provide more workplace charging, and an increasing focus on chargers serving people that are in multi-unit dwellings. You know, it's easy to charge your car when you live in a single family home with a garage, but we recognize that not all Californians do that. And so increasing focus on serving those Californians and making sure that everyone who wants to drive an EV can do so. And then in just the last year, we've seen an increasing focus on zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. So when we talk about medium and heavy duty, we're talking about anything bigger than like a Ford F-150. So up from an F-250, which is a heavier duty pickup truck, all the way to a Class 8 semi tractor trailer, which yesterday I was actually fortunate enough to drive a Class 8 electric truck, a big semi. So I want to let everyone know that these exist. And the Energy Commission is launching a program this year to help fund the chargers that those types of trucks will need. So we're really excited to see, you know, the program moving in that direction. And as we'll talk more about, this bill is hopefully helping to push the CEC even further on advanced technology.
Great, thanks, Meredith. And speaking of the vehicle side of the equation, I know that a lot of people will have potential questions about what other funding programs are out there. And as I alluded to at the top, a lot is going on. Bill, could you provide us some context as to where CTP fits into the wider constellation of state-funded programs?
Sure, and Senator Gonzalez, who has really become an excellent leader on air quality and equity and transportation, really made the case for how we need to clean up transportation in California. And that means cleaning up the vehicles, the fuels, as well as reducing the miles traveled by our vehicles. And in order to do all of that, we need a combination of strong regulatory programs and investments. And when we come to the investments, there's generally a division where the vehicles are funded by the Air Resources Board and the infrastructure by the Energy Commission. It's not always a bright line, but that's mostly how it falls out. In addition to that, the Public Utilities Commission oversees investments by our investor-owned utilities in charging infrastructure. But when it comes to the government putting the money in, we have a lot of vehicle funding coming mostly from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, although this year we're also lucky to have some general fund that the Air Resources Board is handing out for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles, as well as some innovative clean mobility programs. And then we have the Energy Commission through its Clean Transportation Program funding this infrastructure that Meredith talked about. And the Energy Commission has found that, we're really looking at a shortfall in charging for light duty and for medium and heavy duty. So there's a real urgency to getting this money out there effectively.
That's super helpful context, Bill. Appreciate that. All right, let's drill down just a little bit more. Meredith, you guys are the sponsor. What specifically are you hoping to accomplish with the bill, and what does it do kind of more in the weeds? And then Bill, we'll get your perspective from the NGO right after Meredith's.
Yeah, well, as I said, this program was established almost 15 years ago, and I think the senator touched on this as well, but we've done a lot in that time. We've established major landmark climate policies that didn't exist then, like AB 32 and SB 32. And CARB is putting us on this path to zero emission vehicles all across the spectrum. Last year we had CARB adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, which is a sales mandate for medium and heavy duty trucks. And so that is really a game changer. And we need to make sure that the CEC's program is doing everything it can to support this transition, and that they are supporting it on the timeline that we need. And the CEC has great leadership. We have a new commissioner, new since Newsom took office, Patricia Monahan, and she is wonderful. And we just want to use this bill to back up by solidifying the state's goals for climate and clean vehicles and transportation, and really making sure that we can accelerate zero emission truck and bus adoption. So there's about 2,000 zero emission trucks and buses that have received a guarantee for a voucher that covers part of their incremental costs through HVIP, which is this incentive program. And all of those trucks and buses have been waiting for the state to also help them with the infrastructure costs, because this is, the chargers for a heavy duty truck. I saw some yesterday. Like when you fast charge at an EVgo station, you're usually charging at 25 or 50 kilowatts. We're looking at trucks needing charging up to 375. So this is expensive. Fleets don't just need those chargers at their facility, but if we want to transform long haul trucking, we're going to need public truck charging. Transit districts are obviously struggling. They also have a mandate to adopt zero emission buses, and we want to make sure that the CEC's program is supporting that on their timeline as public agencies that provide zero emission mobility to people that either can't afford, to own a zero emission car or don't want to own a car and want to have access to clean, reliable transit. And I know Bill will talk more about this, but we took amendments on the bill advocated for by the environmental and environmental justice community to address equity. And I'll let Bill address those to ensure that we are covering all parts of the state with this funding that all Californians contribute to when they pay their DMV fees. And that again, there's a real theory of market transformation here, that we're going to get the money out the door quickly and design efficient and effective programs. And I don't want to gloss over the fact that the Energy Commission is also our primary research agency in the state. And so this program funds a lot of critical research projects. Right now, there is one for high capacity fast truck charging that's about to launch. So just as an example of the kinds of things that we need the Energy Commission to do more of, and just really to secure and solidify their leadership, and also to ensure that their programs do complement those utility funded programs that Bill and Vince have also mentioned. So all of that is in this bill. It's really doing a lot. The statute was very old. The current statute talks about non-renewable alternative fuels, like non-renewable propane, other things that, are really not the cutting edge anymore. We know we need zero emission technologies everywhere possible. I think renewable biodiesel is the one place where CalSTART really sees that we're going to need renewable diesel to fill certain applications for some time, but just modernizing, updating the program, and laying a foundation to also reauthorize this program, which is going to expire by January 1st, 2023, I'm sorry. And so we really wanted to lay the foundation this year for trying to get, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I know, what we need as a 2/3 vote in the legislature to ensure that this program can continue. So really this bill is all about building the momentum, building the consensus around what this program needs to be doing for the next 10 years. Thanks.
Thanks, Meredith. And you teed up Bill quite nicely. So I'm just going to hand it off to you, Bill, to talk about the equity portion.
Yeah, I mean, Dan Kammen talked earlier about inequity in rooftop solar, and Councilmember Wormsley talked about inequity in the impacts of climate. The same has been true in transportation, where we've seen that our disadvantaged communities have been the last in line to have access to the cleanest forms of mobility. And Coalition for Clean Air is one of the leaders of the Charge Ahead California campaign. We're trying to change that. We want to democratize clean mobility and have electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles available to all Californians, especially those in our disadvantaged and low income communities. And that's why we're really happy that we've had a great collaboration with CalSTART as the sponsor, and with the author, Senator Gonzalez and her staff. And the SB 726 now has really strong equity provisions that the senator talked about, where we would make sure that at least half of the investments in infrastructure that come from the Clean Transportation Program are going to benefit people in those disadvantaged low-income communities. Because we think it's a myth that you cannot have zero emission vehicles in our disadvantaged communities. In fact, those are the places that need them the most because they bear a disproportionate burden of air pollution and climate change. Now, I should mention there is a companion bill by Assemblymember Eloise Reyes, AB 1389, which has similar provisions. And so both these authors are doing a great job of pushing these bills, and we need help to get them over the finish line. So I'm glad there will be an action item on the agenda.
Thank you, Bill. That is super helpful. So I see that we're getting kind of tight on time. So I'm actually going to just reinforce Meredith's point about the need to reauthorize this program. It is a DMV fee, and it is going to require a 2/3 vote. And so we're going to need an all hands on deck type of situation to support that, because there are a lot of vulnerable senators and assembly members out there who are a little wobbly on their willingness to vote for it. But let's go ahead and move over to the question and answer section, and we might be able to revisit that. So one of the first questions that we've gotten is, how does SB 726 interact with CalSTA's CAPTI program, that is their Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, which has a strong equity focus. We really need much tighter coordination on these critical clean transportation goals, funding, and implementation across all the agencies involved. Thank you, Kathy Durbin, for that question. Bill, maybe you want to tackle that first, and then we'll go to Meredith.
Yeah, that is a good question, Kathy. And I think the two are really very consistent. They mostly just address different agencies. So CAPTI, the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, came out of the California State Transportation Agency. And we really support it because it's an effort to change the paradigm when it comes to transportation funding. We have spent too much of our transportation money on expanding capacity, which has driven up emissions and really damaged a lot of our communities. And this is an effort by Secretary Kim and his folks to change that so that we're actually protecting communities and spending money in ways that will reduce emissions and help us to meet our climate standards. That's very consistent with what Senator Gonzalez is doing in this bill. Hers is directed at the Energy Commission. I agree, we need to have more coordination among state agencies. And in particular, we need the California Transportation Commission to actually follow this agenda that is set out by CAPTI and to spend money in ways that are reducing our emissions instead of increasing them.
Yeah, I would say just a quick parallel. There are also elements of this bill that ask these state agencies to work more closely together towards supporting each other's goals for climate and zero emissions. So we also participated in the CAPTI process and submitted comments. And I think it's the same theme of we need every funding agency to support these zero emission goals. Not, they're not just regulations set by CARB that only CARB is responsible for. We need all the funding programs to support things like advanced clean trucks, advanced clean fleets, transforming our freights and goods movement sector and our ports. And CalSTA, the transportation agency, is where the big bucks get spent. I mean, the CEC's program is like $100 million a year total, and that would be, small potatoes if you ever attend a transportation commission meeting where they're spending billions of dollars at a time. They sit on, there's a program there that's $2 billion that we've been trying to get some funds allocated to clean port equipment, zero emission freight, chargers at the port. So I think all these things show better coordination between the agencies, and then we need all the advocates and the stakeholders to show up and make sure that the agencies are doing the right thing.
Thank you both for those answers. Super informative to get your perspectives. Next question comes from Hope Salazar, and I think it's one that about why do we spend more and more government and taxpayer money going towards continuing the single driver, single vehicle paradigm, rather than putting our shoulder to the public transportation wheel, so to speak. And, we saw recent reintroductions for, or re-upping of dollars for Kelly VIP, as well as CVRP, the light duty vehicle program. So Meredith, maybe you should go first on this one, and then we'll go to Bill.
Yeah, I'll just take a quick ad, and then I'm sure Bill has lots of thoughts, but we try to be clear that zero emission transportation equity doesn't just look like everybody owning an EV, that we shouldn't be focused on, single passenger mobility. But we haven't, we recognize that to date, we haven't done a great job providing people with better options for moving around. So there's a new program that just launched and just gave away $40 million in grants called Clean Mobility Options, where communities are deciding what works for them and testing it out with state backing. And we also hope that through this program, the CEC will put more funding into things like EV car share, where that's the best option for a community, electric van pooling, e-bike incentives, shared e-bikes where that works for people. And so again, thinking outside the box a bit more, we see that happening, but we need to put a lot more funding into those kinds of programs.
Bill?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, we need to address vehicles, fuels, and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And it's that last one where we actually have not done as good a job as in the first two. They're all big challenges, but we've done the worst on reducing VMT. And that's why it's so important that we do have new leadership at CalSTA and Caltrans, and we need more new leadership at the Transportation Commission to change that paradigm of investing in single occupant vehicles. Fortunately, the budget agreement does include record amounts of spending on bus and rail transit. The details of that actually have yet to be worked out. So that's something that people could get involved in the last month of the legislature and make sure that that transportation infrastructure budget bill is as good as possible.
Thanks. All right, this is kind of related to your point about VMTs, and it may be a little bit outside the bailiwick of this conversation, but I'll offer it up. To reduce VMTs, we need to stop adding new lanes to roads. What do we do about road widening projects that are in the pipeline? And thanks to Steve Bertelbaugh for that question. Bill or Meredith?
I'm going to throw it to Bill.
Well, I mean, I would say again, it's the Transportation Commission that most needs to come around. Caltrans is coming around. They, after being told by US EPA that their environmental documents were not up to snuff when it came to a proposal for a widening of the 710 freeway, which goes from the ports of LA and Long Beach up through disadvantaged communities in LA. Caltrans said, yeah, we're going back to the drawing board. We're not going to continue with that bad proposal. But unfortunately, at the Transportation Commission, we still have some of the old road gang calling the shots and wanting to continue to invest in new lanes, new capacity.
Sounds good. And I'm sure that there's more opportunities out there to engage at the CTC. It looks like we don't have that many other questions from the audience. So I do want to ask a question of both of you related to, quite frankly, cargo handling equipment, because that is an under recognized sector, but one that has significant impacts, especially on local air quality emission. Bill, what's being done on that front? And Meredith, what's the state of technology out there when it comes to cargo handling equipment?
Well, we need to do a lot more. The Air Resources Board does have the authority to regulate cargo handling equipment and is planning to update those regs. I think that's on the agenda for next year. So, that is, again, something that advocates need to be involved in, and so that we can get that cargo handling equipment reduced to get it to zero emissions as soon as possible. And in the interim, let's have it be the cleanest possible equipment with renewable fuels. Meredith mentioned renewable diesel, which actually is a good step towards cleaning up emissions. And we need to put more pressure on the ports. Frankly, our huge container ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Oakland, they're better than they used to be, but they're not nearly clean enough. And they are governed by public agencies, and people need to put heat on those port commissioners and those elected officials who appoint them to do a much better job of cleaning up the air, because the people living downwind of those ports are generally low-income communities of color, and they're bearing the brunt of all that pollution that's going to move goods that are going to the whole country. And, we've for a long time thought at Coalition for Clean Air that if we raise the price of those goods just a little bit, we can pay to clean up those emissions and make it a lot more equitable and healthy for people living in those downwind communities.
Thanks, Bill. So Meredith, what technologies are going to save us?
Well, I'll be quick, but there is a new program that launched last year and sold out almost immediately for off-road freight and port equipment. So that includes things like yard tractors, which are trucks that just drive around the ports, and other types of port handling equipment that's all zero emission. And some of these technologies are still emerging, but the more the state does to encourage them, the more we can prove that they work and get more ports to adopt them, and then we can move along the path at CARB of mandating zero emission equipment. So CARB did a rulemaking this year on transport refrigeration units, which are, you know, the refrigerated cars that go on the back of a truck. And I think we're all hoping to see more of that. To Bill's point, they have the authority. But also, we kind of glossed over that the Energy Commission got a lot of money in this year's budget for zero emission infrastructure. And part of that is specifically to support port drayage trucks, which aren't exactly port equipment, but they are. The trucks going in and out of the ports are I think, the biggest, if not one of the biggest sources of pollution at those ports. So there's a big push right now by CARB in coordination with the Energy Commission to get 800 zero emission trucks on the road by the end of next year. And so, you know, we hope that'll be really impactful and, you know, particularly for local air quality, and show that they work. So right now we have fleets starting to use those trucks and hopefully starting to believe in them, and ditto on the zero emission port equipment. So we're excited to see budget this year that is dedicated for zero emission port equipment at CARB and also for the infrastructure at the Energy Commission.
And of course, that all ties neatly back to SB 726, since that bill is dealing with all the infrastructure needed to support all this vast array of zero emission mobility options. I see Duran has popped on, which probably means I need to transition over to my colleague Nina to do our action item in support of SB 726. Thank you, Bill and Meredith, for your time and your insights.
Thank you so much for having us.
Nina?
Nina?
Hello again, everyone. So we have our last action item of the summit, and thank you all again for participating and taking action with us today. So we just learned all about SB 726 from our panelists. So now we're going to show our support by contacting our representatives, urging them to support SB 726 for clean, low carbon transportation. So I'm going to drop another link in the chat. And if you click on that, it'll be the all too familiar page we've been using throughout the summit today. So again, just fill out your basic info. And once you do that, click select action at the bottom and submit your letter. And I apologize, I saw in the chat that a lot of people wanted to customize their letter, but we'll definitely take that into consideration the next time we do this. But if you do end up finishing early, feel free to share this link with anyone else that you think would like to take action. This Senate bill will modernize the California Energy Commission's clean transportation program, incorporating the latest state environmental goals and better reflecting recent technological developments and market trends in the clean transportation industry. And if you haven't had a chance to endorse Climate Safe California, let me encourage you to do that before we wrap today. So last link I'll drop in the chat. Oh, and I'll redrop the main take action link since some people did not see it, but there's the Climate Safe California, and I'll reshare the Senate bill action in the chat as well. There you go. And I'll give you all a minute to fill those out. And I want to thank you once again for taking action today, and I'll pass it back to Duran.
Well, thank you, Nina, and thank you, everybody. I have a couple other items to just share with you before we wrap. But before I do that, you know, we've been here for 3 hours. A lot of you I still see, you know, almost 200 folks still on this call. I want to thank you all for sticking through this this policy summit. We covered a lot today. I want to give Vince, our government affairs representative, just a moment to highlight a little bit of what we learned going all the way back to Senator Stern there at 9:30 this morning. Vince, you know, what are some of the takeaways that we want people to remember here today?
So bottom line, I just want to reemphasize that there is a lot going on and there is opportunity for everyone to take action. Climate Safe California, that net negative emissions by 2030 target is something that is an overarching goal that requires pillars to support it. And the bills that we discussed today make up some of those pillars that are going to help us raise Climate Safe California into a reality. And so we need to see those bills be successful in order to get the momentum going for Climate Safe California to get even higher and better. Plus, getting these bills, which you should stay engaged in, enacted, sets the stage for heavier lifts in future years. These successes, as I was saying, build on one another. And so we need to start where we can, where there are actionable places, and just keep moving together and moving to fight and tackle this climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Vince. You're absolutely right. These are steps in a journey, but they're all important that we take those steps together. I want to thank all of you, the hundreds of people who joined us here today. I just want to remind you all, if you believe that those take action items have been useful, and particularly the Climate Safe California endorsement, please do share that widely with others. I'm happy to report we got over half a dozen organizations to endorse Climate Safe California, and just as importantly, close to 60 individuals. Given that many of you have already endorsed Climate Safe California, that's just a wonderful result. We want to thank you all for doing that. We want to thank you all for being here. I do want to let you know we're planning another webinar series focused around maximizing return on investment from climate investments. We're going to be making some announcements about that very soon. So do look forward to more opportunities to connect with people from around California around this important topic of Climate Safe California. I want to take just a moment to thank our sponsors again, Renewable America, Enphase, Jackson Family Wines, Recology, Willow Creek Wealth Management, Soil and Company. Yes, they are quarry miners for the planet. It can be done. MCE and all of our CCA supporters, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Peninsula Clean Energy, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Sunrun, River City Bank, and Terra Verde, and all of the folks who support the Climate Center through contributions, donations, engagement. We have a business network. If you run a business and you're interested in being a part of that, please feel free to contact me, Duran@theclimatecenter.org. I want to thank all of our presenters, going back to Senator Stern. What an inspiring launch he gave us to our policy summit today. Anthony Adragna from Politico, Professors Dan Swain and Dan Kammen, Senator Bill Dodd, Kimberly Wormsley from Stockton, Jonathan Parfrey of Climate Resolve, Nancy Skinner, Senator Skinner, Gianna Amador, and Jeannie Merrill speaking about nature-based sequestration. And of course, to you, Meredith and Bill McGavern, both of you, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. And all of the staff here at the Climate Center who helped make this happen, Vince and Nina and Ellie and Geraldine, who helped moderate and help pull together this incredible panel. I want to thank you all. And mostly, I want to thank you, the 100 plus I think we had about 350 people join this webinar today. I want to thank you all for being here, for being a part of this movement for Climate Safe California. Together, we do still have time, but the time for action is now. So with that said, I'm going to give everyone 2.5 minutes back in their day. We have concluded our agenda. We will be making the recording of this webinar available. You'll all get an email letting you know where you can download that sometime early next week, if not before. You can share it with your friends and colleagues, and you can watch it again and relive all the wonderfulness that was today. So thank you for coming to the Climate Center's 2021 Policy Summit. I really, really appreciate it. We're going to capture the chat here, so we'll stay on for a moment. We're going to end the recording, but I want to thank you all once again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. If you have any issues or questions, and thank you all for all of your kind words, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to help. So thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.